Welcome. You've come for a calming journey into the birth of Roman freedom, designed to lull you into deep, restorative sleep. Immerse yourself in the pivotal events of the early Roman Republic, narrated to ensure your ultimate relaxation. Let's begin now with Book 2 of Titus Livius. Now that I have described the founding of the city of Rome, imagine the chaos as a mighty monarchy collapses, replaced by a daring experiment in self-governance. How did Rome's fierce desire for freedom transform it from a kingdom into the most powerful republic the world had ever seen? And can the echoes of those ancient struggles now bring peace to your modern mind? This isn't just history, it's a timeless saga of courage and change, perfectly paced to guide you into tranquil sleep. Prepare to discover how the dramatic birth of a republic can surprisingly be your new favorite path to rest. If you find this journey peaceful, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more calming historical explorations. The History of Rome, Book 2. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Republic. The affairs, civil and military, of the Roman people, now free, their annual magistrates, and the sovereignty of laws more powerful than that of men. These are the subjects I shall now detail. The haughty insolence of the late king made this liberty all the more welcome. Previous kings had reigned in a manner that could fairly be described as founding various parts of the city, expanding it with new residences for a growing population. There is no doubt that Brutus, who earned such glory for expelling the proud monarch, would have gravely injured the public good if, in an over-hasty desire for liberty, he had wrested the kingdom from any of the preceding kings. Consider what might have happened. A rabble of shepherds, strangers, and fugitives from their own lands, having found liberty, or at least impunity, under an inviolable asylum, might have been uncontrolled by the dread of regal authority. They might have quickly fallen into tribunician storms and engaged in contests with the elders in a foreign city. This before the bonds of wives and children, and love for the very soil, which takes time to cultivate, had united their affections. Their affairs, not yet matured, would have been destroyed by discord. Instead, the tranquil moderation of the government fostered their growth and brought them to such perfection that, with their strength now developed, they were able to produce the wholesome fruits of liberty. The origin of liberty can be dated from this period, primarily because the consular authority became annual, rather than due to any diminution of the kingly prerogative. The first consuls retained all their privileges and ensigns of authority. Care was simply taken that the terror of power might not appear doubled by both consuls having the fasces at the same time. Brutus, with his colleagues' consent, was first attended by the fasces. He proved to be as zealous a guardian of liberty as he had been its assertor. First, he bound the people, still enraptured with their newfound freedom, by an oath. They would suffer no one to be king in Rome. This was to prevent them from being swayed later by the imports or bribes of the royal family. Next, to strengthen the Senate, he filled the number of senators, which had been diminished by the king's murders, to 300, electing principal men of equestrian rank. From this, it is said, the custom arose of summoning into the Senate both those who were patres and those who were conscripti. Those newly elected into the Senate were styled conscripti. This greatly contributed to the concord of the state and attached the affection of the commons to the patricians. Attention then turned to religious matters. Since some public worship had been performed by the kings in person, a king of the sacrifices was elected to ensure no ritual was missed. This office was made subject to the pontiff, so that the added honor of the name would not infringe upon their liberty, which was now their primary concern. Perhaps, by excessively safeguarding liberty on every side, even in the most trivial matters, they may have exceeded bounds. For when there was nothing else to offend, the name of one of the consuls became an object of dislike to the state. The Tarquins had been too accustomed to sovereignty, people whispered. Priscus first began it, Servius Tullus reigned next. Though an interval intervened, Tarquinius Superbus, never losing sight of the kingdom as property, reclaimed it by crime and violence as his family's hereditary right. Superbus was expelled, and now the government is in the hands of Collatinus. The Tarquins do not know how to live as private citizens, the name displeases them. It is dangerous to liberty. Such discussions gradually circulated through the state as people tested opinions. The populace, now roused by jealousy, was called to a meeting by Brutus. There he first recited the people's oath, that they would suffer no one to be king, nor anything to be in Rome whence danger might result to liberty. It ought to be maintained with all their might, and nothing that could tend that way ought to be overlooked. Brutus continued, I say this with reluctance, for the sake of the individual, and would not say it if my affection for the commonwealth did not predominate. The people of Rome do not believe that complete liberty has been recovered. The royal family, the royal name, is not only in the state, but even in the government. That is unfavorable, that is injurious to liberty. Do you, L. Tarquinius, he implored, of your own accord, remove this apprehension. We remember, we acknowledge it, you expelled the royal family. Complete your kindness, take hence the royal name. Your property, your fellow citizens shall not only restore you, by my advice, but if anything is wanted, they will generously supply it. Depart in amity. Relieve the state from a dread which is perhaps groundless. So firmly are they persuaded that only with the Tarquinian race will kingly power depart from here. Amazement was so extraordinary and sudden an occurrence at first impeded the consul's utterance. Then, as he began to speak, the chief men of the state surrounded him, urging the same request with many important opportunities. Others indeed had less weight with him. After Spurius Lucretius, superior in age and rank, and also his father-in-law, began to try various methods, alternately entreating and advising that he should allow himself to be swayed by the general feeling of the state, the consul yielded. Fearing that these same things might befall him later, as a private citizen, with loss of property and additional disgrace, he resigned his consulship. Removing all his effects to Lavinium, he withdrew from the state. Brutus, according to a decree of the Senate, proposed to the people that all the family of the Tarquins should be banished from Rome. In an assembly by centuries, he elected Publius Valerius, who had assisted him in expelling the kings, as his colleague. Though no one doubted that a war with the Tarquins was impending, it broke out later than universally expected. Yet liberty was nearly lost by treachery and fraud, something they had never apprehended. Among the Roman youth were several young men of no mean families who, during the regal government, had pursued their pleasures without restraint. Being of the same age and companions of the young Tarquins, they were accustomed to living in princely style. Longing for that licentiousness, now that the privileges of all were equalized, they complained that the liberty of others had been converted into their slavery. A king was a human being, they argued, from whom you could obtain what was necessary, whether right or wrong. There was room for favor and kindness. He could be angry and could forgive. He knew the difference between a friend and an enemy. But laws were a deaf, inexorable thing, more beneficial for the poor than the rich. They allowed no relaxation or indulgence if you transgressed bounds. It was a perilous state, amid so many human errors, to live solely by one's integrity. While their minds were already discontented, ambassadors from the royal family arrived unexpectedly, demanding only the restitution of their effects, with no mention of their return. After their application was heard in the Senate, deliberation lasted for several days. There was fear that non-restitution might be a pretext for war, and restitution a fund and assistance for war. In the meantime, the ambassadors were planning different schemes. Openly demanding the property, they secretly concerted measures for recovering the throne. Soliciting them as if for the object under consideration, they sounded out feelings. To those by whom their proposals were favorably received, they gave letters from the Tarquins and conferred with them about admitting the royal family into the city secretly by night. The matter was first entrusted to brothers of the name Vitellii and those of the name Aquilii. A sister of the Vitellii had been married to Brutus the consul, and the issue of that marriage were young men, Titus and Tiberius. Their uncles also admitted to participating in the plot. Several other young noblemen were taken in as associates, though the memory of their names has been lost over time. When the opinion prevailed in the Senate to return the property, the ambassadors used this as a pretext for delay in the city, having obtained time from the consuls to procure means of conveyance for the royal family's effects. All this time they spent consulting with the conspirators, and by pressing, succeeded in having letters given to them for the Tarquins. Otherwise, how were the Tarquins to believe that the accounts brought by the ambassadors on matters of such importance were not idle? The letters, given as a pledge of their sincerity, discovered the plot. The day before the ambassadors were to depart, they had chanced to sup at the house of the Vitellii. The conspirators there discoursed much in private concerning their new design. One of the slaves, who had already perceived what was going on, overheard their conversation. He waited for the moment when the letters should be given to the ambassadors, the detection of which would prove the transaction. When he saw them handed over, he laid the whole affair before the consuls. The consuls, having left their home to seize the ambassadors and conspirators, crushed the entire affair without any tumult. Particular care was taken of the letters, lest they should escape. The traitors were immediately thrown into chains. A slight doubt was entertained regarding the ambassadors, and though they deserved to be considered enemies, the law of nations nevertheless prevailed. The question concerning the restitution of the tyrant's effects, which the Senate had formerly voted for, came again under consideration. The elders, fired with indignation, expressly forbade them either to be restored or confiscated. They were given to be plundered by the people, so that by being made participants in the royal plunder, they might forever lose all hopes of a reconciliation with the Tarquins. A field belonging to them, which lay between the city and the Tiber, having been consecrated to Mars, was called the Campus Martius. It happened that there was a crop of corn upon it ready to be cut down. Considering it unlawful to use this produce, after it was harvested, a great number of men carried the corn and straw in baskets and threw them into the Tiber, which then flowed with shallow water, as is usual in the heat of summer. Thus the heaps of corn, sticking in the shallows, settled when covered with mud. By these and the influx of other things that the river happened to bring, an island was formed by degrees. Later, I believe, mounds were added and art provided aid, so that a surface so well raised might be firm enough to sustain temples and porticos. After plundering the tyrant's effects, the traitors were condemned and capital punishment inflicted. Their punishment was more remarkable because the consulship imposed on the father the office of punishing his own children. He who should have been removed as a spectator, fortune assigned as the person to exact the punishment. Young men of the highest quality stood tied to a stake, but the consul's sons attracted the eyes of all spectators from the rest of the criminals, who seemed like unknown persons. The people pitied them not more on account of the severity of the punishment than the horrid crime by which they had deserved it. That they, in that year particularly, should have brought themselves to betray into the hands of Tarquin, formerly a proud tyrant, and now an exasperated exile. Their country just delivered, their father its deliverer, the consulate which took its rise from the family of the Genii, the elders, the people, and whatever belonged either to the gods or the citizens of Rome. The consuls seated themselves in their tribunal, and the lictors, dispatched to inflict punishment, stripped them naked, beat them with rods, and struck off their heads. During all this time, the father, his looks and countenance, presented a touching spectacle, the feelings of a father bursting forth occasionally during the office of superintending the public execution. Next, after the punishment of the guilty, that there might be a striking example in either way for the prevention of crime, a sum of money was granted out of the treasury as a reward to the discoverer. Liberty also, and the rights of citizenship were granted him. He is said to have been the first person made free by the vindicta. Some even think that the term vindicta is derived from him. After him, it was observed as a rule that those who were set free in this manner were supposed to be admitted to the rights of Roman citizens. Chapter 2. The Etrurian War. When these events were announced to Tarquin, he was inflamed not only with grief at the frustration of such great hopes, but also with hatred and resentment. Seeing that stratagem was blocked, he resolved to resort to open warfare. He went as a suppliant to the cities of Etruria. "Do not allow me," he implored, "sprung from yourselves of the same blood, exiled and in want, lately in possession of such a great kingdom, to perish before your eyes, along with my sons. Others were invited to Rome from foreign lands to take the throne. I, a king who extended the Roman Empire by arms, was driven out by those closest to me through a villainous conspiracy. They have violently divided the parts among themselves, because no single individual among them was deemed sufficiently deserving of the kingdom. They gave up my effects to the people to be plundered, so that no one might be free from that guilt. I am desirous to recover my country and my kingdom, and to punish my ungrateful subjects. You should bring succor and aid me. You might also avenge the injuries done to you of old, your legions so often slaughtered, your land taken from you. These arguments swayed the people of VI. With threats, they declared that now, at last, under the conduct of a Roman general, their former disgrace should be wiped off, and what they had lost in war should be recovered. Tarquin's name and relation to them induced the people of Tarquinii to take his side. It seemed an honor that their countrymen should reign at Rome. Therefore, the armies of these two states followed Tarquin to recover his kingdom and to take vengeance upon the Romans. When they entered Roman territories, the consuls marched to meet them. Valerius led the infantry in a square battalion, and Brutus rode ahead with his cavalry to reconnoiter the enemy. The enemy's cavalry likewise came up first, commanded by Aruns, Tarquin's son. The king himself followed with the legions. Aruns, recognizing a consul at a distance by the lictors, and then certainly identifying Brutus by his face as he drew nearer, cried out, inflamed with rage, "There is the villain who has banished us from our native country. See how he rides in state, adorned with the ensigns of our dignity. Now assist me, gods, the avengers of kings." He spurred his horse and drove furiously against the consul. Brutus perceived the attack. As it was honorable in those days for generals to engage in combat, he eagerly offered himself to the fight. They encountered each other with such furious animosity, neither mindful of protecting his own person, provided he could wound his adversary. Both, transfixed through the shield by the blow from the opposite direction, fell lifeless from their horses, entangled together by their two spears. The engagement between the rest of the cavalry commenced at the same time, and soon after the infantry arrived. They fought with doubtful success, with equal advantage, and an uncertain victory. The right wings of both armies were victorious, and the left worse. The Veientians, accustomed to being discomfited by Roman soldiers, were routed and put to flight. The Tarquinienses, a new enemy, not only stood their ground, but even on their side obliged the Romans to give way. After the outcome of this battle, so great a terror seized Tarquin and the Etrurians that both armies, the Veientian and Tarquinian, giving up the matter as impracticable, departed to their respective homes. They attached strange incidents to this battle, that in the silence of the next night a loud voice was emitted from the Arsian wood, believed to be the voice of Silvanus. These words were spoken, that more of the Etrurians by one had fallen in the battle, that the Roman was victorious in the war. Certainly, the Romans departed thence as victors, the Etrurians as vanquished. As soon as it was light, and not one of the enemy was now to be seen, Publius Valerius, the consul, collected the spoils and returned thence in triumph to Rome. At his colleague's funeral, he celebrated with all the magnificence possible. But a far greater honor to his death was the public sorrow, singularly remarkable in this particular. The matrons mourned him a year, as a parent, because he had been so vigorous an avenger of violated chastity. Afterwards, the surviving consul, such is the changeableness of people's minds, encountered not only jealousy but suspicion, originating in an atrocious charge, despite his great popularity. Report claimed that he aspired to the crown because he had not substituted a colleague in the place of Brutus, and was building a house on the summit of Mount Velia. This, they feared, would be an impregnable fortress on an elevated and well-fortified place. When these circulated and believed reports affected the consul's mind with indignation, he summoned the people to an assembly. He mounted the rostrum after lowering the fasces. It was a welcome sight to the multitude that the insignia of authority were lowered to them, acknowledging that the majesty and power of the people were greater than that of the consul. When they were called to silence, Valerius highly extolled the good fortune of his colleague, who, after delivering his country, had died vested with supreme power, fighting bravely in defense of the Commonwealth, when his glory was in its maturity and not yet converted into jealousy. That he himself, having survived his glory, now remained as an object of accusation and calumny. That from the liberator of his country, he had fallen to the level of the Aquilii and Vitellii. Will no merit, then, he asked, ever be so tried and approved by you as to be exempted from the attacks of suspicion? Could I apprehend that I, the bitterest enemy of kings, should fall under the charge of a desire for royalty? Could I believe that, even though I dwelt in the very citadel and the capital, I could be dreaded by my fellow citizens? Does my character among you depend on so mere a trifle? Is my integrity so slightly founded that it makes more matter where I may be than what I may be? The house of Publius Valerius shall not stand in the way of your liberty, Romans. The Velian Mount shall be secure to you. I will not only bring down my house into the plain, but I will build it beneath the hill, that you may dwell above me, a suspected citizen. Let those build on the Velian Mount to whom liberty is more securely entrusted than to Publius Valerius. Immediately all the materials were brought down to the foot of the Velian Mount, and the house was built at the foot of the hill where the Temple of Victory now stands. After this, laws were passed which not only cleared him of all suspicions of aiming at regal power, but had so contrary a tendency that they made him popular. From then he was surnamed Publicola, meaning friend of the people. Above all, the laws regarding an appeal to the people against the magistrates, and that dedicating the life and property of anyone who should form a design of assuming regal authority, were well received by the people. After he had passed these while sole consul, so that the merit in them was exclusively his own, he then held an assembly for the election of a new colleague. Spurius Lucretius was elected consul, who, being very old and his strength inadequate to discharge the consular duties, died in a few days. Marcus Horatius Pulvillus was substituted in the place of Lucretius. In some old writers, I find no mention of Lucretius as consul. They place Horatius immediately after Brutus. I believe that, because no important event signalized his consulate, it has been unnoticed. Jupiter's temple in the Capitol had not yet been dedicated. The consuls Valerius and Horatius cast lots to decide which should dedicate it. It fell by lot to Horatius. Publicola departed for the war of the Veientians. The friends of Valerius were more annoyed than they should have been that the dedication of such a celebrated temple should be given to Horatius. Having tried every means to prevent that, when all other attempts had failed, and as the consul was now holding the doorpost during his offering of prayer to the gods, they suddenly announced to him the shocking intelligence that his son was dead, and that his family being defiled, he could not dedicate the temple. Whether he did not believe the fact or possess such great firmness of mind is neither handed down for certain, nor is a conjecture easy. Unmoved by this intelligence, other than to order that the body should be buried, he completed the prayer and dedicated the temple. These were the transactions at home and abroad the first year after the expulsion of the kings. After this, Publius Valerius a second time and Titus Lucretius were elected consuls. By this time, the Tarquins had fled to Lars Porsena, king of Clusium. There, mixing advice with their entreaties, they sometimes begged him not to allow them, who were descended from the Etrurians and of the same blood and name, to live in exile and poverty. At other times, they advised him not to let this commencing practice of expelling kings pass unpunished. Liberty has charms enough in itself, they argued, and unless kings defend their crowns with as much vigor as the people pursue their liberty, the highest must be reduced to a level with the lowest. There will be nothing exalted, nothing distinguished above the rest. And hence there must be an end of regal government, the most beautiful institution both among gods and men. Porsena, thinking that it would be an honor to the Tuscans both that there should be a king at Rome, and especially one of the Etrurian nation, marched towards Rome with a hostile army. Never before on any other occasion did so great terror seize the Senate. So powerful was the state of Clusium at the time, and so great the renown of Porsena. Nor did they only dread their enemies, but even their own citizens, lest the common people, through excessive fear, should, by receiving the Tarquins into the city, accept peace even if purchased with slavery. Many conciliatory concessions were therefore granted to the people by the Senate during that period. Their attention, in the first place, was directed to the markets, and persons were sent, some to the Volscians, others to Cumae, to buy up corn. The privilege of selling salt, also, because it was farmed at a high rent, was all taken into the hands of the government and withdrawn from private individuals. The people were freed from port duties and taxes, that the rich, who were adequate to bear the burden, should contribute, that the poor paid tax enough if they educated their children. This indulgent care of the fathers accordingly kept the whole state in such concord amid the subsequent severities in the siege and famine that the highest abhorred the name of king not more than the lowest. Nor was any single individual afterwards so popular by intriguing practices as the whole Senate then was by their excellent government. Some parts seemed secured by the walls, others by the interposition of the Tiber. The Sublician bridge very nearly afforded a passage to the enemy, had there not been one man, Horatius Cockles, that defended the fortune of Rome on that day. Happening to be posted on guard at the bridge, when he saw the Janiculum taken by a sudden assault, and that the enemy were pouring down from thence at full speed, and that his own party, in terror and confusion, were abandoning their arms and ranks, he laid hold of them one by one, standing in their way, and appealing to the faith of gods and men. He declared, "Your flight will avail you nothing if you desert your post. If you pass the bridge and leave it behind you, there will soon be more of the enemy in the Palladium and Capitol than in the Janiculum. For that reason, I advise and charge you to demolish the bridge, by your sword, by fire, or by any means whatever. I will stand the shock of the enemy, as far as can be done by one man." He then advanced to the first entrance of the bridge. Easily distinguished among those who showed their backs in retreating from the fight, he turned to engage the foe hand to hand. By his surprising bravery, he terrified the enemy. 2 men, indeed, a sense of shame kept with him, Spurius Lartius and Titus Herminius, eminent for their birth and renowned for their gallant exploits. With them, he for a short time withstood the first storm of the danger and the severest brunt of the battle. But as those who were demolishing the bridge called upon them to retire, he obliged them also to withdraw to a place of safety on a small portion of the bridge still left. Then, casting his stern eyes around all the officers of the Etrurians in a threatening manner, he sometimes challenged them singly, sometimes reproached them all. The slaves of haughty tyrants, who, regardless of their own freedom, came to oppress the liberty of others. They hesitated for a considerable time, looking round at one another to commence the fight. Shame then put the army in motion, and a shout being raised, they hurled their weapons from all sides on their single adversary. When all their darts struck the shield held before him, and he with no less obstinacy kept possession of the bridge with firm step, they now endeavored to thrust him down from it by one push. At once, the crash of the falling bridge, and a shout of the Romans raised for joy at having completed their purpose, checked their ardor with sudden panic. Then Cockles cried, "Holy Father Tiberinus, I pray that you would receive these arms and this soldier in your propitious stream." Armed as he was, he leaped into the Tiber. Amid showers of darts hurled on him, he swam across safely to his party, having dared an act which is likely to obtain more fame than credit with posterity. The state was grateful towards such valor. A statue was erected to him in the Comitium, and as much land was given to him as he plowed around in one day. The zeal of private individuals also was conspicuous among the public honors. For, amid the great scarcity, each person contributed something to him according to his supply at home, depriving himself of his own support. Poor Senna, repulsed in his first attempt, changed his plans from a siege to a blockade. After placing a garrison in Janiculum, he pitched his camp in the plain along the banks of the Tiber. He then sent for boats from all directions, both to guard the river and prevent provisions from reaching Rome, and to transport his soldiers across for plundering as needed. In a short time, he so harassed the entire country around Rome that not only goods, but even their cattle were driven into the city. No one dared venture outside the gates. This freedom of action was granted to the Etrurians not so much through fear as from policy. Valerius, intent on an opportunity to fall unawares upon a large, straggling number of them, was a lenient avenger in trifling matters, reserving his full vengeance for more important occasions. Therefore, to decoy the pillagers, he ordered his men to drive their cattle the next day out at the Esquiline Gate, which was farthest from the enemy. He presumed the enemy would get intelligence from it, knowing that during a blockade and famine, some slaves would turn traitors and desert. Indeed, they were informed by a deserter, and parties more numerous than usual, hoping to seize the entire herd, crossed the river. Then Publius Valerius commanded Titus Herminius, with a small body of men, to lie concealed 2 miles from the city on the Gabian road. Spurius Lartius, with a party of light-armed troops, was to post himself at the Colline Gate until the enemy passed by, then to cut off their return to the river. The other consul, Titus Lucretius, marched out of the Naevian Gate with some companies of soldiers. Valerius himself led some chosen cohorts down from the Celian Mount, and they were the first described by the enemy. Herminius, perceiving the alarm, rose from ambush and fell upon the rear of the Tuscans, who had charged Valerius. The shout was returned on the right and left, from the Colline Gate on one hand, and the Naevian on the other. By this stratagem, the plunderers were put to the sword between both forces. They were no match in strength for fighting, and all escape routes were blocked. This put an end to the Etrurians strolling about in such a disorderly manner. Nevertheless, the blockade continued, and there was a scarcity of corn with very high prices. Porsenna hoped that by continuing the siege, he would take the city. But then came Gaius Mucius, a young nobleman, to whom it seemed a disgrace that the Roman people, when enslaved under kings, had never been confined within their walls in any war, nor by any enemy. Now, as a free people, they were blocked up by these very Etrurians whose armies they had often routed. Thinking that such indignity should be avenged by some great and daring effort, he first designed on his own accord to penetrate into the enemy's camp. Then, afraid that if he went without the permission of the consuls or the knowledge of anyone, he might be seized by Roman guards and brought back as a deserter, the city's circumstances at the time justifying such a charge, he went to the Senate. "Fathers," he said, "I intend to cross the Tiber and enter the enemy's camp if I can, not as a plunderer, or as an avenger in our turn of their devastations. A greater deed is in my mind, if the gods assist." The Senate approved his design. He set out with a sword concealed under his garment. When he arrived, he positioned himself among the thickest of the crowd, near the king's tribunal. There, as the soldiers were receiving their pay, the king's secretary sat by him, dressed nearly in the same style, busily engaged, and to him they commonly addressed themselves. Afraid to ask which of them was Porsenna, lest by not knowing the king he should reveal himself, as fortune blindly directed the blow, he killed the secretary instead of the king. As he was going off, where with his bloody dagger he had made his way through the dismayed multitude, a crowd gathered at the noise. The king's guards immediately seized and brought him back, standing alone before the king's tribunal. Even then, amidst such menaces of fortune, more capable of inspiring dread than of feeling it, he declared, "I am a Roman citizen. My name is Gaius Mucius. An enemy, I wish to slay an enemy, nor have I less resolution to suffer death than I had to inflict it. Both to act and to suffer with fortitude is a Roman's part, nor have I alone harbored such feelings towards you. There is after me a long train of persons aspiring to the same honor. Therefore, if you choose it, prepare yourself for this peril, to contend for your life every hour, to have the sword and the enemy in the very entrance of your pavilion. This is the war which we, the Roman youth, declare against you. Dread not an army in array, nor a battle. The affair will be to yourself alone, and with each of us singly." When the king, highly incensed and at the same time terrified at the danger, menacingly commanded fires to be kindled about him, if he did not speedily explain the plots which, by his threats, he had darkly insinuated against him, Mucius said, "Behold me, that you may be sensible of how little account the body is to those who have great glory in view." And immediately He thrust his right hand into the fire that was lit for the sacrifice. When he continued to burn it as if he had been quite insensible, the king, astonished at this surprising sight, leaped from his throne and commanded the young man to be removed from the altar. He said, "Begone, having acted more like an enemy towards yourself than me. I would encourage you to persevere in your valor, if that valor stood on the side of my country. I now dismiss you untouched and unhurt, exempted from the right of war." Then Mucius, as if making a return for the kindness, said, "Since bravery is honored by you, so that you have obtained by kindness that which you could not by threats, 300 of us, the chief of the Roman youth, have conspired to attack you in this manner. It was my lot first. The rest will follow, each in his turn, according as the lot shall set him forward, unless fortune shall afford an opportunity for you." Mucius being dismissed, to whom the cognomen of Scaevola was afterwards given, from the loss of his right hand, ambassadors from Porsenna followed him to Rome. The risk of the first attempt, from which nothing had saved him but the mistake of the assailant, and the risk to be encountered so often in proportion to the number of conspirators, made so strong an impression upon him that of his own accord he made propositions of peace to the Romans. Mention was made to no purpose regarding the restoration of the Tarquins to the throne, rather because he had been unable to refuse that to the Tarquins, than from not knowing that it would be refused to him by the Romans. The condition of restoring their territory to the Veientians was obtained by him, and the necessity of giving hostages in case they wished the garrison to be withdrawn from the Janiculum was extorted from the Romans. Peace being concluded on these terms, Porsenna drew his troops out of the Janiculum and marched out of the Roman territories. The elders gave Mucius, as a reward of his valor, lands on the other side of the Tiber, which were afterwards called the Mucian Meadows. By this honor paid to valor, the women were excited to merit public distinctions. As the camp of the Etrurians had been pitched not far from the banks of the Tiber, a young lady named Cloelia, one of the hostages, deceiving her keepers, swam over the river, amidst the darts of the enemy, at the head of a troop of virgins, and brought them all safe to their relations. When the king was informed of this, at first highly incensed, he sent deputies to Rome to demand the hostage of Cloelia. He did not regard the others. Afterwards, changing to admiration of her courage, he said that this action surpassed those of Cockles and Mucius, and declared, as he would consider the treaty as broken if the hostage were not delivered up, so, if given up, he would send her back safe to her friends. Both sides kept their faith. The Romans restored their pledge of peace, according to the treaty. With the king of Etruria, Merit found not only security but honor. After praising the young lady, he promised to give her, as a present, half of the hostages, and that she should choose whom she pleased. When they were all brought out, she is said to have chosen the young boys below puberty, which was both consonant to maidenly delicacy, and by consent of the hostages themselves, it was deemed reasonable that that age which was most exposed to injury should be freed from the enemy's hand. With peace being re-established, the Romans marked the uncommon instance of bravery in the woman by an uncommon kind of honor, an equestrian statue. The statue representing a lady sitting on horseback was placed at the top of the Via Sacra. Inconsistent with this peaceful departure of the Etrurian king from the city is the custom handed down from the ancients, and which continues to our times among other usages at public sales, that of selling the goods of King Porsenna. The origin of this custom must either have occurred during the war and was not relinquished in peace, or it must have increased from a milder source than the form of expression imports, of selling the goods in a hostile manner. Of the accounts handed down, the most probable is that Porsenna, on retiring from the Janiculum, made a present to the Romans of his camp, well stored with provisions conveyed from the neighboring and fertile fields of Etruria, the city being then exhausted by the long siege. This, lest it should be carried away in a hostile manner, by the people being admitted, was then sold and called the goods of Porsenna, the expression rather importing gratitude for the gift than an auction of the king's property, which never even was in the power of the Roman people. Porsenna, after ending the Roman war, so that his army might not seem to have been led into these parts without effecting anything, sent his son Aruns with a part of his forces to besiege Aricia. The matter not being expected, the Aricians were at first terrified. Afterwards, assistance, which was sent from the people of Latium and Cumae, inspired so much hope that they ventured to meet them in the field. At the commencement of the battle, the Etrurians attacked the Aricians so furiously that they routed them at the first onset. But the Cuman cohorts, opposing stratagem to force, moved off a little to one side. When the enemy were carried beyond them in great disorder, they faced about and charged them in the rear. By this means the Etrurians, when they had almost secured victory, were enclosed and cut to pieces. A very small part of them, having lost their general because they had no nearer refuge, came to Rome without their arms, in the condition and with the air of suppliants. There they were kindly received and provided with lodgings. When their wounds were cured, many of them went home and told of the kind hospitality they had met with. Affection for their hosts and for the city detained many at Rome. A place was assigned them to dwell in, which they have ever since called the Tuscan Street. Chapter 3. Peace with Porsenna and the Latin War. Then Publius Lucretius and Publius Valerius Publicola were elected consuls. This year, ambassadors came from Porsenna for the last time regarding the restoration of Tarquin to the throne. When they were answered that the Senate would send deputies to the king, some of the principal persons of that order were forthwith dispatched to represent to him that it was not because the answer could not have been given in a few words, that the royal family would not be received, that select members of the Senate had been deputed to him, rather than an answer given to his ambassadors at Rome. But it was done so that all mention of the matter might be put an end to forevermore, and that their minds might not be disturbed amidst so many mutual acts of kindness, by his requiring what was adverse to the liberty of the Roman people, and by their denying to him to whom they would willingly deny nothing, unless they would submit to their own ruin. That the Roman people were not now under a kingly government, but in a state of freedom, and were firmly determined rather to open their gates to enemies than to kings. That it was the wish of all that their city might have the same period of existence as their freedom in that city. Therefore, if he wished Rome to be safe, they entreated that he would suffer it to be free. The king, overcome by modesty, said, "Since it is your firm and fixed resolve, I will neither tease you by repeatedly urging these same subjects more frequently, nor will I disappoint the Tarquins by holding out hopes of aid which it is not in my power to give them. Whether they have a need for peace or of war, let them seek another place from here for their exile, that nothing may disturb the peace between you and me." To these kind promises he added actions that are still more friendly. For he delivered up the remainder of the hostages and restored to them the land of the Veientians, which had been taken from them by the treaty concluded at Janiculum. Tarquin, all hopes of return being now cut off, went to Tusculum to live in exile with his son-in-law Mamilius Octavius. Thus, the peace between Porsenna and the Romans was inviolably preserved. Marcus Valerius and Publius Posthumius were chosen consuls. This year, war was carried on successfully against the Sabines. The consuls received the honor of a triumph. Upon this, the Sabines made preparations for war on a larger scale. To make head against them, and lest any sudden danger might arise from Tusculum, whence they suspected a war, though it was not yet declared, Publius Valerius was created consul a fourth time, and Titus Lucretius a second time. A disturbance arising among the Sabines, between the advisers of war and of peace, transferred some additional strength to the Romans. Attus Clausus, later called Appius Claudius at Rome, himself an advocate for peace, was hard-pressed by those who abetted the war. Being no match for the opposing faction, he fled from Regillum to Rome, accompanied by a great number of clients. The rights of citizenship and land on the other side of the Anio were conferred on them. This new settlement was called the Old Claudian Tribe, and was increased by the addition of some tribesmen who had come from that country. Appius, chosen into the Senate, was soon after advanced to the highest dignity of that order. The consuls, having entered the territories of the Sabines with a hostile army, both by laying waste their country and afterwards by defeating them in battle, so weakened the power of the enemy that they had no reason to dread their taking up arms again for a long time. They returned to Rome in triumph. The following year, Agrippa Menenius and Publius Posthumius being consuls, Publius Valerius, universally allowed to be the ablest man in Rome in both peace and war, died at the height of his glory. Yet he died so poor that it meant to defray the expenses of his funeral. He was buried at the public charge. The matrons mourned for him as they had done for Brutus. The same year, 2 Latin colonies, Pometia and Cora, revolted against the Orontians. War was commenced against the Orontians. After defeating a numerous army of them, who boldly met the consuls entering their frontiers, the entire Orontian war was confined to Pometia. Nor, after the battle was over, did they refrain from slaughter more than in the heat of the action. A greater number were slain than taken, and the prisoners they put to death indiscriminately. Nor did the enemy, in their resentment, spare even the 300 hostages they had received. This year also, the consuls triumphed at Rome. The following consuls, Opiter Virginius and Spurius Cassius, first endeavored to take Pometia by storm, and afterwards by razing Vinii and other siege works. But the Orontians, prompted more by an irreconcilable hatred against them than by hopes of success or a favorable opportunity, sallied out of the town. Though more of them were armed with lighted torches than swords, they filled all places with fire and slaughter. After they had burned down the Vinii, and slain and wounded many of the enemy, they nearly killed one of the consuls, who had been thrown from his horse and severely wounded. Authors do not mention which one. Upon this, the Romans returned to Rome, foiled in their object. The consul was left among many more, who were wounded with very uncertain hopes of his recovery. After a short time, sufficient for curing their wounds and recruiting their army, they marched against Pometia with redoubled fury and augmented strength. When the Vinii had been repaired and the other apparatus of war were ready, the soldiers were on the point of scaling the walls, and the town surrendered. Yet, though the town had surrendered, the leading men of the Orontians, with no less cruelty than if it had been taken by assault, were beheaded indiscriminately. The others, who were colonists, were sold by auction. The town was razed and the land sold. The consuls obtained a triumph more from having severely gratified their revenge than in consequence of the importance of the war thus brought to a close. The following year had Posthumus Cominius and Titus Lartius for consuls. In this year, during the celebration of games at Rome, some of the courtesans were being carried off by some Sabine youths in a frolic. A mob assembled, a scuffle ensued, and almost a battle. From this inconsiderable affair, the whole nation seemed inclined to a renewal of hostilities. Besides the dread of the Latin war, this accession further added to their fears. Certain intelligence was received that 30 different states had entered into a confederacy against them, at the instigation of Octavius Mamilius. While the city was perplexed amidst the expectation of such important events, mention was made for the first time of nominating a dictator. But in what year, or who the consuls were in whom confidence was not reposed because they were of the Tarquinian faction, for that also is recorded, or who was elected dictator for the first time, is not satisfactorily established. Among the oldest writers, however, I find that Titus Lartius was appointed the first dictator and Spurius Cassius master of the horse. They chose men of consular dignity, for so the law, made for the election of a dictator, ordained. For this reason, I am more inclined to believe that Lartius, who was of consular rank, was annexed to the consuls as their director and master, rather than Manius Valerius, the son of Marcus and grandson of Valesus, who had not yet been consul. Had they intended to choose a dictator from that family in particular, they would much rather have chosen his father, Marcus Valerius, a consular person and a man of distinguished merit. On the creation of the dictator first at Rome, when they saw the axes carried before him, great awe struck the common people, so that they became more submissive to obey orders. For neither was there now, as under the consuls who possessed equal power, the assistance of one of the two, nor was there appeal, nor was there any resource anywhere but in attentive submission. The creation of a dictator at Rome terrified the Sabines, and more effectively because they thought he was created on their account. Therefore, they sent ambassadors to sue for peace, to whom, when earnestly entreating the dictator and Senate to pardon the young men's offense, an answer was given that the young men could easily be forgiven, but not the old men, who continually raised one war after another. Nevertheless, they continued to treat peace, and it would have been granted if the Sabines would bring themselves to make good the expenses incurred on the war, for that was demanded. War was proclaimed. A tacit truce kept the year quiet. Servius Sulpicius and Marcus Tullius were consuls the next year. Nothing worth mentioning happened. Then Titus Abusius and Gaius Vitusius. In their consulship, Fidene was besieged, Crustamiria taken, and Praeneste revolted from the Latins to the Romans. Nor was the Latin war, which had been fomenting for several years, any longer deferred. Aulus Postumius, dictator, and Titus Abusius, his master of the horse, marching with a numerous army of horse and foot, met the enemy's forces at Lake Regillus, in the territory of Tusculum. Because it was heard that the Tarquins were in the army of the Latins, their rage could not be restrained, but they must immediately come to an engagement. Accordingly, the battle was more obstinate and fierce than usual. The generals were present not only to direct matters by their orders, but even charged one another, exposing their own persons. Hardly any of the principal officers of either side came off unwounded, except the Roman dictator. As Postumius was drawing up his men and encouraging them in the first line, Tarquinius Superbus, though now enfeebled by age, spurred on his horse with great fury to attack him. But being wounded in the side, he was carried off by a party of his own men to a place of safety. In the other wing also, Abusius, master of the horse, had charged Octavius Mamilius. Nor was his approach unobserved by the Tusculan general, who also briskly spurred on his horse to encounter him. Such was their impetuosity as they advanced with hostile spears that Abusius was run through the arm and Mamilius struck on the breast. The Latins received the latter into their second line, but as Abusius was not able to wield his lance with his wounded arm, he retired from the battle. The Latin general, not in the least discouraged by his wound, stirred up the fight. Seeing his own men begin to give ground, he sent for a company of Roman exiles to support them, commanded by Tarquin's son. This body, fighting with greater fury from having been banished from their country and lost their estates, restored the battle for a short time. When the Romans were beginning to give ground on that side, Marcus Valerius, brother to Poplicola, observed young Tarquin boldly figuring away at the head of his exiles. Fired with the renown of his family, that the slaying of the princes might belong to the same family whose glory their expulsion had been, he clapped spurs to his horse, and with his javelin present made towards Tarquin. Tarquin retired from his violent enemy into a battalion of his own men. As Valerius rushed rashly into the line of the exiles, one of them ran him sideways through the body. As the horse was in no way retarded by the wound of his rider, the expiring Roman fell to the ground, his arms falling over him. Postumius the dictator, seeing so distinguished a man slain, the exiles advancing boldly in a body, and his own men disheartened and giving ground, gave the signal to his own cohort, a chosen body of men which he kept for the defense of his person, to treat every Roman soldier whom they should see fly from the battle as an enemy. Upon this, the Romans, because of the danger on both sides, turned from their flight against the enemy. The battle being restored, the dictator's cohort now for the first time engaged in the fight, and with fresh vigor and undaunted resolution falling on the wearied exiles, cut them to pieces. Here, another engagement took place between the leading officers. The Latin general, seeing the cohort of the exiles almost surrounded by the Roman dictator, advanced in haste to the front with some companies of the body of reserve. Titus Herminius, a lieutenant general, having seen them moving in a body, and well knowing Mamilius, distinguished from the rest by his armor and dress, encountered the leader of the enemy with a force so much superior to that wherewith the general of the horse had lately done, that at one thrust he ran him through the side and slew him. While stripping the body of his enemy, he himself received a wound with a javelin. Though brought back to the camp victorious, he died during the first dressing of it. Then the dictator flew to the cavalry, entreating them in the most pressing terms, as the infantry were tired out with fighting, to dismount from their horses and join the fight. They obeyed his orders, dismounted, flew to the front, and taking their post at the first line, covered themselves with their shields. The infantry immediately recovered courage when they saw the young noblemen sustaining a share of the danger with them, the mode of fighting being now assimilated. Thus at length were the Latins beaten back, and their line giving way, they retreated. The horses were then brought up to the cavalry that they might pursue the enemy, and the infantry likewise followed. On this, the dictator, omitting nothing that could conciliate divine or human aid, is said to have vowed a temple to Castor, and likewise to have promised rewards to the first and second of the soldiers who should enter the enemy's camp. Such was their ardor that the Romans took the camp with the same impetuosity with which they had routed the enemy in the field. Such was the engagement at Lake Regillus. The dictator and master of the horse returned to the city in triumph. For the next 3 years, there was neither settled peace nor open war. The consuls were Quintus Clelius and Titus Lartius. After them, Aulus Sempronius and Marcus Minucius. In their consulship, a temple was dedicated to Saturn, and the Saturnalia was appointed to be kept as a festival. Then Aulus Postumius and Titus Virginius were chosen consuls. In some authors, I find that the battle at Lake Regillus was not fought until this year, and that Aulus Postumius, because the fidelity of his colleague was suspected, laid down his office and thereupon was created dictator. Such great mistakes of dates perplex one with the history of these times, the magistrates being arranged differently in different writers, that you cannot determine what consuls succeeded certain consuls, nor in what particular year every remarkable action happened, by reason of the antiquity, not only of the facts but also of the historians. Then Appius Claudius and Publius Servilius were elected consuls. This year was remarkable for the news of Tarquin's death. He died at Cumae, where he had fled to the tyrant Aristodemus, after the reduction of the power of the Latins. The Senate and people were elated by this news. But with the senators, their satisfaction was too extravagant, for by the chief men among them, oppression began to be practiced on the people, to whom they had to that day been attentive to the utmost of their power. The same year, the colony which King Tarquin had sent to Signia was recruited by filling up the number of the colonists. The tribes at Rome were increased to 21, and the Temple of Mercury was dedicated on the 15th of May. During the Latin War, there had been an uneasy peace with the Volscians. They had raised auxiliary troops to aid the Latins, but the swift action of the Roman dictator prevented a combined assault. In response, the Roman consuls marched their army into Volscian territory. The Volscians, surprised and fearing retribution for their intentions, offered 300 children from prominent families in Cora and Pometia as hostages. The Roman legions then withdrew without engaging in battle. However, their natural disposition soon reasserted itself. Freed from immediate fear, the Volscians secretly prepared for war, forming an alliance with the Hernicians. They sent ambassadors throughout Latium, seeking to incite rebellion against Rome. But the recent defeat at Lake Regillus had left the Latins unwilling to consider further conflict. Instead, they seized the Volscian ambassadors and brought them to Rome, reporting the war preparations of the Volscians and Hernicians. The Roman Senate was greatly pleased by this action. They released 6,000 Latin prisoners and referred the matter of a new treaty to the incoming magistrates. The Latins, overjoyed by this outcome, sent a gold crown to the capital as an offering to Jupiter. A large crowd, including the freed prisoners, accompanied the ambassadors. These former captives visited the homes of those who had held them, expressing gratitude for their kind treatment. New bonds of hospitality were formed, and at no other time had the Latin people been so closely united with the Roman state. Chapter 4. The Secession of the Plebs. Yet a new Volscian war loomed, and internal strife plagued Rome. Intense animosity simmered between the Senate and the people, primarily due to the plight of those imprisoned for debt. Citizens loudly complained that while they fought for liberty and dominion abroad, they were oppressed by their own countrymen at home. They argued that the people's liberty was more secure in war than in peace, among enemies than among fellow citizens. This growing discontent was further aggravated by the striking suffering of one individual. An old man appeared in the forum, bearing all the marks of his misery. His clothes were squalid, his body pale and emaciated. A long beard and hair gave his face a wild, haggard look. Despite his wretchedness, he was recognized as a former centurion. People spoke openly of his distinguished military service, and he displayed scars on his chest, testaments to honorable battles. When repeatedly asked about his deplorable state, the old man addressed the assembled crowd. He explained that during the Sabine War, enemy depredations had stripped him of his land and burned his home. His possessions were pillaged, his cattle driven off. A burdensome tax, imposed at a distressing time, had forced him into debt. This debt, compounded by usury, had first cost him his ancestral farm, then his other property, and finally his very person. He declared that his creditor had taken him, not into servitude, but into a house of correction and execution. He then exposed his back, disfigured with recent lash marks. A great uproar erupted at this sight and story. The tumult spread beyond the forum, through the entire city. Debtors, both confined and recently freed, rushed into the streets, imploring the people's protection. Volunteers for sedition appeared everywhere. Crowds ran through the streets to the forum, shouting loudly. Senators present in the forum found themselves in great danger, and violence might have ensued had not the consuls, Publius Servilius and Appius Claudius, intervened to quell the disturbance. The multitude turned to the consuls, displaying their chains and other signs of misery. They claimed to have earned such suffering through their military service, taunting the consuls with their individual deeds in battle. They demanded, with threats rather than pleas, that the Senate be convened. They then surrounded the Senate House, determined to witness and direct the public councils. Only a few senators, who happened to be present, were forced to join the consuls. Fear kept the rest from attending the House or even the forum. No business could be conducted due to the sparse attendance. The people then began to believe their demands were being evaded, and redress of their grievances delayed. They suspected that the absent senators were deliberately obstructing the proceedings, and that the consuls themselves were trifling with them, mocking their miseries. The sedition reached such a height that the consuls' authority could barely restrain the people's violence. Uncertain whether they faced greater danger at home or abroad, the senators eventually arrived. But even with a full house, disagreement manifested not only among the senators, but also between the consuls themselves. Appius, a man of violent temper, believed the situation demanded decisive consular action, arguing that arresting one or two individuals would quiet the rest. Servilius, favoring more moderate measures, felt it would be safer and easier to bend, rather than break, the people's agitated spirits. Amidst these debates, a more serious terror emerged. Latin horsemen galloped into Rome with alarming news. The Volscians were marching with a hostile army to besiege the city. This announcement, so deeply divided the state, affected the senators and people in vastly different ways. The people exulted, proclaiming that the gods had arrived to avenge the tyranny of the fathers. They urged each other not to enroll for military service, declaring it better to perish together than alone. They insisted that the patricians should serve as soldiers and bear arms, so that the perils of war would remain with those who reaped its advantages. The Senate, however, was dejected and confounded by this dual threat, from both their own countrymen and the enemy. They implored Consul Servilius, whose temperament was more conciliatory, to extricate the Commonwealth from its great dangers. The consul then dismissed the Senate and addressed the assembly. He assured them that the Senate was solicitous of the people's interests. But the alarm for the entire Commonwealth had interrupted their deliberation regarding what was a significant, yet still only a part, of the state. With the enemy almost at the gates, nothing could take precedence over war. He argued that it would neither be to the people's credit to refuse to defend their country without first receiving recompense, nor consistent with the senator's dignity to offer relief out of fear rather than later from inclination. He instilled further confidence in the assembly with an edict. No one should detain a Roman citizen in chains or prison, hindering their enrollment under the consuls. No one should seize or sell a soldier's goods while he was in camp, or arrest his children or grandchildren. Upon the publication of this ordinance, the debtors under arrest immediately enrolled their names. Crowds of people hastened from all parts of the city, their creditors now powerless to detain them, gathering in the forum to take the military oath. These men formed a considerable body, and their bravery and activity were highly evident in the Volscian War. The consul led his army against the enemy and pitched camp a short distance away. The following night, the Volscians, relying on Roman internal dissension, attempted a surprise attack on their camp, hoping for desertion or treachery. The sentinels detected them, the army was roused, and the signal for arms was given. The Volscian attempt was thwarted, and the rest of the night was spent in repose by both sides. At daybreak, the Volscians filled the trenches and attacked the rampart. The fortifications were already being demolished on all sides when the consul, though everyone, especially the debtors, cried out for the signal, delayed briefly to gauge the soldiers' resolve. When their great ardor became apparent, he finally gave the signal for a sally. The soldiers, eager for the fight, poured forth. At the very first onset, the enemy was routed. The fleeing rear was harassed by the infantry as long as they could pursue, while the cavalry drove them in consternation to their camp. Soon after, the camp itself was taken and plundered, the legions having surrounded it as panic drove the Volscians even from that refuge. The next day, the legions marched to Suessa Pometia, where the enemy had retreated. The town was taken in a few days and given over to plunder, providing some relief to the needy soldiers. The consul led his victorious army back to Rome with immense glory. As he departed for Rome, deputies from the Aegatrans, a Volscian faction, alarmed for their state after the fall of Pometia, approached him. By a decree of the Senate, peace was granted to them, but their land was confiscated. Immediately afterward, the Sabines also caused alarm for the Romans, though it was more a tumult than a full-scale war. News arrived in the city during the night that a Sabine army had advanced as far as the Anio River, plundering the countryside and indiscriminately burning down farmhouses. Aulus Postumius, who had been dictator in the Latin War, was immediately dispatched against them with all the cavalry. Consul Servilius followed with a chosen body of infantry. The cavalry cut off most of the stragglers. The Sabine legion offered little resistance against the Roman foot soldiers when they caught up. Exhausted by their night march and plundering, and many surfeited with food and drink from the cottages, they had barely enough strength for flight. The Sabine War, thus heard of and concluded in a single night, was followed by a hopeful expectation of widespread peace. However, ambassadors from the Orontians then arrived at the Senate, declaring war unless Roman troops withdrew from Volscian territory. The Orontian army had already set out with their ambassadors. The report of their approach, not far from Aricia, caused such a tumult among the Romans that the Senate could not be consulted in proper form. Nor could they, while themselves taking up arms, give a peaceful answer to those advancing against them. The Romans marched to Aricia with a determined army, engaged the enemy not far from there, and ended the war in a single battle. After the defeat of the Orontians, the Roman people, victorious in many recent wars, eagerly awaited the fulfillment of the consul's promises and the Senate's commitments. However, Appius, driven by his inherent pride and a desire to undermine his colleagues' influence, issued decrees regarding borrowed money with the utmost severity. Consequently, those previously imprisoned for debt were returned to their creditors, and new arrests were made. When this fate befell a soldier, he appealed to Servilius, Appius's colleague. A crowd gathered around Servilius, reminding him of his promises, reproaching him with their military service and their scars. They demanded that he present the matter to the Senate, and that as consul he relieved his fellow citizens and as a general his soldiers. These pleas moved the consul, but the situation forced him to retreat. Not only his colleague, but the entire body of patricians had adopted a completely opposing stance. By trying to steer a middle course, Servilius neither escaped the people's hatred nor gained the Senate's favor. The senators viewed him as a weak, popularity-seeking consul, while the people considered him a deceiver. It soon became clear that he was as odious to them as Appius himself. A dispute arose between the consuls over which of them should dedicate the Temple of Mercury. The Senate referred the matter to the people, ordaining that whoever was chosen by popular vote to perform the dedication would also preside over the markets, establish a company of merchants, and perform the functions of a Pontifex Maximus. The people bestowed the dedication upon Marcus Laetorius, a centurion of the First Legion, clearly intending to insult the consuls rather than honor a man beyond his rank. This deeply incensed one of the consuls in particular, and the senators. However, the people had grown emboldened and now acted quite differently from their initial intentions. Despairing redress from the consuls and senate, they swarmed together from all quarters whenever they saw a debtor being led to court. Neither the consul's decree could be heard over the noise and clamor, nor, once pronounced, was it obeyed. Everything was managed by violence, and the fear and danger regarding personal liberty shifted from the debtors to the creditors, who were publicly abused by the crowd in the consul's very presence. In addition to all this, the dread of a Sabine war spread. When a levy was decreed, no one volunteered. Appius, enraged, bitterly denounced his colleague's ambitious tactics, accusing him of betraying the Republic through his popular silence and neglecting to raise the voted levies, besides failing to pass judgment against debtors. Yet, Appius declared that the Commonwealth was not entirely deserted, nor the consular authority altogether debased. He alone would vindicate both his own dignity and that of the senators. When a daily mob, emboldened by their defiance, surrounded him, Appius ordered a notorious ringleader of the sedition to be apprehended. As the lictors carried him off, the man appealed to the people. The consul would not have allowed the appeal, as there was no doubt regarding the people's judgment, had not his obstinacy been overcome, with difficulty, by the advice and influence of leading men rather than by the clamor of the populace. Such was his resolution to bear the weight of their odium. The trouble grew daily, not only through open clamor but, far more dangerously, through secession and secret meetings. At last the consuls, so odious to the commons, left office. Servilius was liked by neither party, while Appius was highly esteemed by the senators. Then Aulus Virginius and Titus Veturius entered the consulship. The commons, uncertain what kind of consuls they would have, held nightly meetings, some on the Esquiline and others on the Aventine Hill. This was to avoid hasty resolutions in the forum or ill-considered, uncoordinated measures. The consuls, judging this proceeding dangerous, as it indeed was, laid the matter before the Senate. However, they were not allowed to take votes in regular order. Such was the tumultuous outcry and indignation from all sides of the Senate at the consuls for casting upon them the odium of something that should have been suppressed by consular authority. It was declared that if there were truly magistrates in the Republic, there would be no council in Rome but the public one. The Republic was now divided into 1,000 senates and assemblies, some on the Esquiline, others on the Aventine. One man truly, such as Appius Claudius, for that was more than a consul, would instantly disperse these private meetings. When the consuls, thus rebuked, asked them what they desired them to do, promising to act with as much energy and vigor as the senators wished, the Senate resolved that they should press on with the levies as briskly as possible, believing the people had become insolent from idleness. When the session broke up, the consuls ascended the tribunal and summoned young men by name. But none answered. The people crowded around them, as if in a general assembly, declaring that the people would no longer be imposed upon. They would never enlist another soldier until public faith was restored. Liberty should be given to each before arms were given, so they might fight for their country and fellow citizens, not for arbitrary lords. The consuls fully understood the orders they had received from the Senate, but they saw none of those who had spoken so boldly within the Senate House present themselves to share in the public odium. A desperate contest with the commons seemed imminent. Therefore, before resorting to extremities, they decided to consult the Senate a second time. Then, indeed, the younger senators rushed around the consuls' chairs, commanding them to abdicate the consulship and resign an office they lacked the courage to support. Having sufficiently tried both approaches, the consuls at last said, "Conscript fathers, lest you say you were not forewarned, a great disturbance is at hand. We require that those who accuse us most severely of cowardice assist us in raising the levies. We shall proceed according to the resolution of the most intrepid among you, since it pleases you so." They returned to their tribunal and deliberately called out by name one of the most factious of the people, who stood in plain sight. When he remained silent, and a ring of men stood around him to prevent his seizure, the consuls sent a lictor to him. The lictor was repulsed. Such senators as were with the consuls, exclaiming against this as an intolerable insult, rushed from the tribunal to assist the lictor. But when the violence turned from the lictor, who suffered nothing more than being prevented from seizing the man, against the senators themselves, the riot was quelled by the consul's intervention. In this incident, however, without stones or weapons, there was more noise and angry words than actual harm done. The Senate, called in a tumultuous manner, was consulted in an even more tumultuous fashion. Those who had been beaten clamored for an inquiry, and the most violent members declared their sentiments with shouts and noise no less than by their votes. At length, when their passion subsided, the consuls reproached them for the disorderly conduct within the Senate itself, matching that in the Forum. The House then began to vote in regular order. There were 3 different opinions. Publius Virginius did not generalize the matter. He voted that they should consider only those who, relying on the promise of Consul Publius Servilius, had served in the war against the Auruncans and Sabines. Titus Largius was of the opinion that it was not the time to reward services only. He argued that all the people were immersed in debt, and that the problem could not be stopped unless measures were adopted for everyone. He believed that if the conditions of different parties remained disparate, divisions would be inflamed rather than resolved. Appius Claudius, naturally severe, and now utterly infuriated by the commons' hatred and the senators' praise, declared that these riots stemmed not from distress, but from license. He asserted that the people were more wanton than violent. This terrible mischief, he claimed, originated from the right of appeal, since only threats, not authority, belonged to the consuls, while permission was given to appeal to those who were accomplices in the crime. "Come," he added, "let us create a dictator from whom there lies no appeal. This madness, which has set everything aflame, will immediately subside. Let anyone then dare to strike a lictor, when he knows that his back, and even his life, are in the power of that person whose authority he has insulted." To many, Appius's opinion appeared, as it truly was, severe and violent. On the other hand, those of Virginius and Largius were deemed unsafe for the precedent they established, especially Largius's, as it would destroy all credit. Virginius's opinion was considered the most moderate and a happy medium between the other two. But through the spirit of faction and a regard for private interest, which always have and always will obstruct public councils, Appius prevailed. He himself was nearly appointed dictator. This step would certainly have alienated the commons at this most dangerous juncture, when the Volsci, Equi, and Sabines all happened to be in arms at the same time. However, the consuls and elder senators took care that this office, by its very nature uncontrollable, should be committed to a man of moderate temper. They chose Manius Valerius, son of Volesus, as dictator. The people, although they saw that this magistrate was created against them, yet, having gained the right of appeal through his brother's law, feared nothing oppressive or tyrannical from that family. An edict of the dictator, almost identical to that published by Consul Servilius, further calmed their minds. Judging it safer to confide in both the man and the absolute power with which he was vested, they gave in their names, ceasing all contention. 10 legions were levied, a larger army than had ever been raised before. Each of the consuls was assigned 3 legions, and the dictator commanded 4. The war could no longer be deferred. The Equi had made incursions upon Latin territory. Deputies of the Latins begged the Senate either to send them assistance or to allow them to arm themselves to defend their frontiers. It seemed safer that the Latins should be defended without arming, rather than allowing them to take up arms again. Therefore, Veturius the consul was sent to their assistance, which immediately stopped the devastations. The Equi retired from the plains and, relying more on the advantage of the ground than on their arms, secured themselves on the mountain summits. The other consul, having marched against the Volsci, in order that he too might not waste time, challenged the enemy to pitch their camp near his, and to risk an engagement by ravaging their lands. Both armies stood in battle formation before their lines in a plain between the two camps. The Volsci had a considerable advantage in numbers. Accordingly, they rushed into the fight carelessly, as if contemptuously. The Roman consul neither advanced his forces, nor allowed the enemy's shouts to be returned. He ordered his men to stand still with their spears fixed in the ground, and when the enemy approached, to draw their swords and attack with full force. The Volsci, wearied with running and shouting, attacked the Romans as if they were numbed with fear. But when they encountered vigorous resistance and saw swords glittering before their faces, they turned their backs in great disorder, as if they had fallen into an ambush. They had insufficient strength even for flight, having advanced to battle at full speed. The Romans, on the other hand, having not moved from their ground at the beginning of the action, were fresh and vigorous. They easily overtook the weary enemy, took their camp by assault, and after driving them thence, pursued them to Velletri, into which the conquered and conquerors entered together. The indiscriminate slaughter here spilled more blood than in the battle itself. Quarter was given to a small number, who threw down their arms and surrendered. While these events unfolded among the Volsci, the dictator swiftly defeated the Sabines, routing them and seizing their camp, which had been the most serious front of the war. A cavalry charge had disrupted the center of the enemy's line, where their overextended wings had created an insufficient depth of files. The Roman infantry attacked this confusion, and with a single assault, their camp was taken, concluding the war. No other battle in those times was more memorable than this, since the action at Lake Regillus. The dictator was borne into the city in triumph. Besides the usual honors, a place in the circus was assigned to him and his descendants to watch the public games, marked by a curule chair. The lands of Velletri were taken from the conquered Volsci, and colonists from Rome were sent to establish a new settlement there. Soon after, there was an engagement with the Equi, but against the consul's wishes, as they had to approach the enemy over disadvantageous ground. However, the soldiers complained that the war was intentionally prolonged, so the dictator might resign before they returned to the city. They feared his promises would, like the consuls before them, prove hollow. They forced him to march the army up the hill, regardless of the risk. This imprudent step, due to the enemy's cowardice, proved successful. Before the Romans came within dart's reach, the Equi, amazed by their boldness, abandoned their strongly fortified camp and fled down into the valleys on the opposite side. Abundant booty was found, and the victory was bloodless. With military matters thus successfully concluded on three fronts, anxiety regarding domestic differences consumed both the senators and the people. The moneylenders, with powerful influence and cunning, had made arrangements to disappoint not only the people, but even the dictator himself. Valerius, after Consul Veturius's return, first brought before the Senate the matter concerning the victorious people, proposing a discussion on the plight of those confined for debt. When this motion was rejected, he declared, "I am not acceptable as an adviser of concord. You will long wish, depend on it, that the commons of Rome had patrons similar to me. For my part, I will neither further disappoint my fellow citizens, nor will I be dictator to no purpose." Internal dissensions and foreign wars caused the Republic to require such a magistrate. Peace has been secured abroad, it is impeded at home. I will be a witness to disturbance as a private citizen rather than as dictator. Then, quitting the Senate House, he abdicated his dictatorship. To the commons, it appeared that he had resigned his office out of indignation at their treatment. Accordingly, as if his engagements to them had been fully discharged, since it was not his fault that they were not made good, they attended him returning home with approbation and applause. Fear then seized the senators, lest if the army were dismissed, secret meetings and conspiracies would resume. Therefore, Although the levy had been held by the dictator, they believed that, having sworn obedience to the consuls, the soldiers were bound by their oath. Under the pretext of renewed hostilities by the Equi, they ordered the legions to be let out of the city. This action, however, hastened the sedition. It is said that at first, the commons contemplated putting the consuls to death to be absolved from their oath. But being later informed that no religious obligation could be dissolved by a criminal act, they, on the advice of one Cincinnatus, retired without the consul's orders to the Sacred Mount, beyond the Anio River, 3 miles from the city. This account is more widely accepted than Piso's version, which states the secession was to the Aventine. There, without any leader, their camp fortified with a rampart and trench, they remained quiet for several days, taking nothing but necessities, neither attacking nor being attacked. Great panic gripped the city, and through mutual fear, all was suspense. The people remaining in the city dreaded the violence of the senators. The senators dreaded the people, uncertain whether they preferred them to stay or depart. But how long would the seceded multitude remain quiet? What would be the consequences if, in the meantime, any foreign war broke out? They recognized that no hope remained safe in the concord of the citizens. This had to be restored to the state by fair or foul means. It was therefore resolved to send Menenius Agrippa as an ambassador to the people. He was an eloquent man and a favorite of the people because he originated from among them. Admitted into the camp, he is said to have related to them simply the following story in his antiquated and unrefined style. At a time when all the parts of the human body did not, as now, agree together, but each member had its own scheme, its own language, the other parts became indignant. They saw that everything was procured for the belly by their care, labor, and service, while the belly remained quiet in the center, doing nothing but enjoying the pleasures afforded it. They conspired, accordingly, that the hands should not convey food to the mouth, nor the mouth receive it when presented, nor the teeth chew it. While they wished, under the influence of this feeling, to subdue the belly by famine, the members themselves and the entire body were reduced to the last degree of emaciation. Then it became apparent that the service of the belly was by no means a slothful one. It did not so much receive nourishment as supply it, sending to all parts of the body this blood, by which we live and possess vigor, distributed equally to the veins when perfected by the digestion of the food. By thus comparing the internal strife of the body to the people's resentment against the senators, he made a strong impression on the minds of the multitude. Then, a reconciliation began to be negotiated. Among the conditions, it was agreed that the commons should have their own magistrates, with inviolable privileges, who should have the power of bringing assistance against the consuls, and that it should not be lawful for any of the patricians to hold that office. Thus, 2 tribunes of the commons were created, Caius Licinius and Lucius Albinus. These 2 then created 3 colleagues for themselves. It is clear that Cincinnatus, the instigator of the sedition, was among them. Who the other 2 were is not as clear. Some say that only 2 tribunes were elected on the Sacred Mount, and that there the devoting law was passed. Chapter 5. Coriolanus and the Volscian War. During the secession of the commons, Spurius Cassius and Posthumus Cominius entered the consulship. During their term, the treaty with the Latin states was concluded. To ratify this, one of the consuls remained in Rome. The other, sent to the Volscian War, routed and put to flight the Volscians of Antium. Continuing his pursuit of them, now driven into the town of Longula, he took possession of the town. Next he took Pelusca, also belonging to the Volscians. Then he attacked Corioli with all his force. There was then in the camp, among the young noblemen, Caius Marcius, a youth distinguished for both intelligence and courage, who later earned the cognomen Coriolanus. As the Roman army was besieging Corioli, wholly intent on the townspeople they had shut up, without any apprehension of a threat from without, a Volscian legion from Antium suddenly attacked them. At the same moment, the enemy sallied forth from the town. Marcius happened to be on guard. With a chosen body of men, he not only repelled the attack of those who had sallied out, but boldly rushed in through the open gate. Having cut down all in the nearest part of the city, and hastily seized some fire, he threw it into the houses adjoining the wall. At this, the shouts of the townspeople mingled with the wailing of the women and children, caused by the initial fright. As is usual, this both increased the courage of the Romans and disheartened the Volscians, who saw the city they had come to relieve now captured. Thus, the Volscians of Antium were defeated, and the town of Corioli was taken. So much did Marcius's valor eclipse the consul's reputation that, had not the treaty concluded with the Latins by Spurius Cassius alone, because his colleague was absent, served as a memorial of it, it would have been forgotten that Postumus Cominius had conducted the war with the Volscians. The same year, Agrippa Maninius died. He was a man throughout his life equally favored by the senators and commons, and even more endeared to the commons after the secession. For this man, the mediator and umpire in restoring concord among his countrymen, the ambassador of the senators to the commons, the person who brought the commons back to the city, the expenses of his funeral were lacking. The people buried him by contributing a sextans each. Chapter 6. Agrarian Law and Internal Strife. Titus Geganius and Publius Minucius were the next elected consuls. In this year, when everything was quiet from foreign war and domestic dissensions were healed, another much more serious evil befell the state. First, a scarcity of provisions, in consequence of the lands lying until during the secession of the commons, then a famine such as afflicts those who are besieged. It would have ended in the destruction of at least the slaves, and indeed some of the commons, had not the consuls adopted precautionary measures. They sent people in every direction to buy up grain, not only into Etruria on the coast to the right of Ostia, and through the Volscians along the coast on the left as far as Cumae, but also into Sicily. So far the hatred of their neighbors obliged them to seek aid from distant countries. When grain had been bought up at Cumae, the ships were detained in lieu of the property of the Tarquinii by the tyrant Aristodemus, who was their heir. Among the Volsci and in the Pomptine territory, it could not even be purchased. The grain dealers themselves incurred danger from the violence of the inhabitants. Grain came from Etruria by the Tiber, and by this means the people were supported. Amid this distressing scarcity, they would have been harassed by a very inconvenient war, had not a dreadful pestilence attacked the Volsci just as they were about to commence hostilities. The minds of the enemy were alarmed by this calamity, so that they were influenced by some terror even after it had abated. The Romans both augmented the number of their colonists at Velletri and dispatched a new colony to the mountains of Norba to serve as a barrier in the Pomptine district. Then, in the consulship of Marcus Minucius and Aulus Sempronius, a great quantity of grain was imported from Sicily, and it was debated in the Senate at what rate it should be given to the commons. Many were of the opinion that the time had come to put down the commons and to recover those rights that had been wrested from the senators by secession and violence. In particular, Marcius Coriolanus, an enemy to tribunician power, declared, "If they desire the former rate of provisions, let them restore to the senators their former rights. Why do I, after being sent under the yoke, after being, as it were, ransomed from robbers, behold plebeian magistrates and Sicinius invested with power? Shall I submit to these indignities longer than is necessary? Shall I, who would not have endured King Tarquin, tolerate Sicinius? Let him now secede, let him call away the commons. The road lies open to the sacred mount and to other hills. Let them carry off the grain from our lands, as they did 3 years ago. Let them have the benefit of that scarcity, which in their frenzy they have occasioned. I will venture to say that, brought to their senses by these sufferings, they will themselves become tillers of the lands, rather than taking up arms and seceding, prevent them from being tilled. It is not so easy to say whether it should have been done, as I think that it might have been practicable for the senators, on the condition of lowering the price of provisions, to have rid themselves of both the tribunician power and all the restraints imposed on them against their will. This proposal seemed too harsh to the Senate, and nearly drove the people to arms out of sheer exasperation. They cried that they were under siege by famine, as if by enemies. They were being defrauded of food and sustenance, and the foreign corn, their only unexpected salvation, was being snatched from their mouths. This, unless the tribunes were delivered in chains to Gaius Marcius, unless he could foment his rage on the backs of Rome's common people. A new executioner had emerged in him, ordering them to die or be enslaved. An assault would have been made on him as he left the Senate house, had not the tribunes opportunely appointed a day for his trial. This suppressed the people's rage, for each person now saw themselves as a judge, an arbiter of their enemy's life and death. At first, Marcius heard the tribunes' threats with contempt. He argued that their office granted them the right to offer aid, not to inflict punishment. They were tribunes of the common people, he claimed, not of the senators. But the common people had risen with such violent determination that the senators were obliged to consider extricating themselves from danger by punishing one of their own. However, they resisted despite public animosity, employing both individual and collective power. First, they attempted to disrupt the affair by stationing their clients in various places, deterring individuals from attending meetings and gatherings. Then, they all proceeded in a body, as if every senator were on trial, earnestly entreating the common people that if they would not acquit Marcius as innocent, they would at least pardon him as guilty. One citizen, one senator. As Marcius did not attend on the appointed day, the people persisted in their resentment. Condemned in his absence, he went into exile among the Volsci, threatening his country and still breathing the full resentment of an enemy. The Volsci received him kindly. They treated him even more kindly each day as his resentment towards his countrymen became more evident, and as his frequent complaints and threats were heard. He lodged with Attius Tullus, who was then the chief man of the Volscian people and always a determined enemy of the Romans. Thus, old animosity spurred Tullus, and recent resentment spurred Marcius. Together, they schemed to bring about a war with Rome. They did not immediately believe their people could be persuaded to take up arms, having been so often unsuccessful. They felt that after many wars, and especially after the loss of their youth to pestilence, their spirits were now broken. They would need to resort to cunning, given that animosity had dulled with time, so that their feelings might be re-exasperated by some fresh cause of resentment. It happened that preparations were being made in Rome for a repetition of the great games. The reason for repeating them was this. On the morning of the original games, before the show had begun, a master, after flogging his slave, who was loaded with a neck yoke, had driven him through the middle of the circus. The games then commenced, as if that incident held no religious significance. Not long after, Atinius, a plebeian, had a dream. Jupiter seemed to tell him that the person who danced before the games had displeased him. Unless these games were renewed on a splendid scale, the city would be in danger. He was to go and announce these things to the consuls. Though Atinius's mind was not entirely free from superstitious feelings, his awe of the magistrate's dignity overcame his religious fear, lest he become a laughingstock. This delay cost him dearly, for he lost his son within a few days. Unless the cause of this sudden calamity be doubtful, the same phantom, presenting itself to his sorrowful mind, seemed to ask him whether he had received sufficient requital for his contempt of the deity. A still heavier one awaited him, unless he immediately delivered the message to the consuls. The matter was now even more pressing. Hesitating and delaying, he was at length overcome by a severe stroke of disease, a sudden paralysis. Then indeed, the anger of the gods aroused him. Warned by his past sufferings and by those threatening him, he convened a meeting of his friends. After detailing all he had seen and heard, and how Jupiter had so often appeared to him in his sleep, and how the threats and anger of heaven were realized in his own calamities, he was conveyed in a litter to the consuls in the forum, with the unhesitating assent of all present. From there, he was carried into the Senate house. After he had stated these same particulars to the senators, to everyone's great surprise, another miracle occurred. He who had been carried into the Senate house, deprived of the use of all his limbs, is recorded to have returned home on his own feet after discharging his duty. The Senate decreed that the games should be celebrated on as grand a scale as possible. To these games, a great number of Volscians came at the advice of Attius Tullus. Before the games began, Tullus, as had been arranged with Marcius at home, approached the consuls. He told them that he wished to speak with them privately about matters concerning the Commonwealth. With all witnesses removed, he said, "With reluctance, I speak of my countrymen in a disparaging way. However, I do not come to accuse them of anything already committed, but to guard against their committing anything. The minds of our people are far more fickle than I could wish. We have felt this through many disasters, seeing that we are still preserved not through our own merits, but through your forbearance. There is now a great multitude of Volscians here. The games are underway. The city will be intent on the exhibition. I remember what was committed in this city on a similar occasion by the youth of the Sabines. My mind shudders lest anything be committed inconsiderately and rashly. I considered that these matters should be mentioned beforehand to you, consuls. As for myself, it is my determination to depart home immediately lest, if present, I may be affected by the contagion of any word or deed." Having said this, he departed. When the consuls laid the matter before the Senate, it was doubtful regarding proof, though it came from credible authority. The authority, more than the thing itself, as often happens, urged them to adopt even needless precautions. A decree of the Senate was passed that the Volscians should quit the city, and criers were sent in different directions to order them all to depart before night. A great panic struck them at first as they ran to their lodgings to carry away their effects. Afterward, as they were setting out, indignation arose in their breasts, that they, as if polluted with crime and contaminated, were driven away from the games on festival days, from the converse, as it were, of men and gods. As they went along in an almost continuous body, Tullus, who had preceded them to the fountain of Ferentina, accosted the chiefs among them as each arrived. By asking questions and expressing indignation, he led both them, who greedily listened to language congenial to their angry feelings, and through them, the rest of the multitude, into a plain adjoining the road. There, having commenced an address in the manner of a public harangue, he said, "Though you were to forget the former ill-treatment by the Roman people and the calamities of the Volscian nation, and all other such matters, with what feelings do you bear this outrage offered you today, whereon they have commenced their games by insulting us? Have you not felt that a triumph has been had over you this day? That you, when departing, were a spectacle to all, citizens, foreigners, so many neighboring states? That your wives, your children were exhibited before the eyes of men? What do you suppose to have been the sentiments of those who heard the voice of the crier? What of those who saw you departing? What of those who met this ignominious cavalcade? What, except that we are identified with some enormous guilt by which we should profane the games and render an expiation necessary? That for this reason we are driven away from the residences of these pious people, from their converse and meeting? Does it not strike you that we still live only because we hastened our departure? If this is a departure and not a flight, and do you not consider this to be the city of enemies, where if you had delayed a single day, you must all have died? War has been declared against you, to the heavy injury of those who declared it, if you are men. Thus, already charged with resentment and incited by this harangue, they went separately to their homes. By instigating each his own state, they succeeded in making the entire Volscian nation revolt. The generals selected for that war by the unanimous choice of all the states were Attius Tullus and Gaius Marcius. In Marcius, their chief hope was placed, and he by no means disappointed it, so much so that it clearly appeared that the Roman Commonwealth was more powerful by reason of its generals than its army. Having marched to Circeii, he expelled the Roman colonists and delivered that city in a state of freedom to the Volscians. From there, passing across the country through byroads into the Latin Way, he deprived the Romans of their recently acquired towns, Satricum, Longula, Pelusca, and Corioli. He next retook Lavinium. He then successively took Corbio, Vitellia, Trebia, Lavasae, and Pedum. Lastly, he marched from Pedum to the city itself. Having pitched his camp at the Cluilian trenches, 5 miles from the city, he ravaged the Roman territory. Guards were sent among the devastators to preserve the lands of the patricians intact, either because he was incensed chiefly against the plebeians, or in order that dissension might arise between the senators and the people. And this certainly would have arisen, so powerfully did the tribunes, by inveighing against the leading men of the state, incite the plebeians, who were already violent enough themselves. But their apprehensions of the foe, the strongest bond of concord, united their minds, distrustful and rancorous though they were. The only matter not agreed on was this: the Senate and consuls rested their hopes on nothing else than arms. The plebeians preferred anything to war. Spurius Nautius and Sextus Furius were now consuls. While they were reviewing the legions and posting guards along the walls and other places where they had determined there should be posts and watches, a vast multitude of persons demanding peace terrified them first by their seditious clamor. Then they compelled them to convene the Senate to consider sending ambassadors to Gaius Marcius. The Senate entertained the question when it became evident that the spirits of the plebeians were giving way. Ambassadors sent to Marcius concerning peace brought back a harsh answer. If their lands were restored to the Volscians, then they might consider the question of peace. If they were disposed to enjoy the plunder of war at their ease, then he, mindful of both the injurious treatment by his countrymen, as well as the kindness of strangers, would do his utmost to make it appear that his spirit was irritated by exile, not crushed. When the same persons were sent back a second time, they were not admitted into the camp. It is recorded that the priests also, arrayed in their insignia, went as suppliants to the enemy's camp, and that they did not influence his mind any more than the ambassadors. Then the Roman matrons assembled en masse around Veturia, Coriolanus's mother, and his wife Volumnia. Whether this was the result of public counsel or the women's own fear, we cannot ascertain. They certainly succeeded in their aim. Veturia, a lady advanced in years, and Volumnia, leading her 2 sons by Marcius, would go into the enemy's camp. Women would defend, with entreaties and tears, a city that men could not defend with arms. When they reached the camp, and it was announced to Coriolanus that a great body of women was approaching, he, who had been unmoved by the majesty of the state in its ambassadors, nor by the sanctity of religion so strikingly presented to his eyes and understanding in its priests, was far more obdurate against the women's tears. Then one of his acquaintances, recognizing Veturia, distinguished from all the others by her sadness, standing between her daughter-in-law and grandchildren, said, "Unless my eyes deceive me, your mother, children, and wife are approaching." When Coriolanus, almost like one bewildered, rushed in consternation from his seat to embrace his mother as she met him, the lady, turning from entreaties to angry rebuke, said, "Before I receive your embrace, let me know whether I have come to an enemy or to a son, whether I am in your camp a captive or a mother. Has length of life and a hapless old age reserved me for this, to behold you in exile, then an enemy? Could you lay waste this land, which gave you birth and nurtured you? Though you had come with an incensed and vengeful mind, did not your resentment subside when you entered its frontiers? When Rome came within view, did it not occur to you, within these walls are my house and guardian gods, my mother, wife, and children? So then, had I not been a mother, Rome would not be besieged. Had I not had a son, I might have died free in a free country. But I can now suffer nothing that is not more discreditable to you than distressing to me, nor, however wretched I may be, shall I be so long. Look to these whom, if you persist, either an untimely death or lengthened slavery awaits." Then his wife and children embraced him. The lamentation from the entire crowd of women, and their bemoaning themselves and their country, at length overcame the man. After embracing his family, he sent them away and moved his camp farther back from the city. After he had drawn off his troops from Roman territory, it is said that he lost his life, overwhelmed by the odium of his actions. Different writers describe different modes of death. However, I find in Fabius, by far the most ancient writer, that he lived even to old age. Fabius states positively that, advanced in years, Coriolanus used this phrase, that exile bore much heavier on the old man. The men of Rome were not slow in awarding their praises to the women, for they truly lived without detracting from the merit of others. A temple was also built and dedicated to female fortune, to serve as a monument. The Volscians later returned in conjunction with the Equi into Roman territory. But the Equi would no longer accept Attius Tullus as their leader. Hence, from a dispute over whether the Volscians or the Equi should provide a general for the allied army, a sedition arose, and afterward a furious battle. There, the good fortune of the Roman people destroyed the two armies of the enemy, by a contest no less bloody than obstinate. Titus Sicinius and Gaius Aquilius were made consuls. The Volsci fell as a province to Sicinius, the Hernici, for they too were in arms, to Aquilius. That year the Hernici were defeated. They fared on equal terms with respect to the Volscians. Spurius Cassius and Proculus Virginius were next made consuls. A treaty was struck with the Hernici. 2/3 of their land was taken from them. Of this, Consul Cassius was about to distribute 1/2 among the Latins, and the other half among the common people. To this donation, he was adding a considerable portion of land which, though public property, he alleged was possessed by private individuals. This proceeding alarmed several senators, the actual possessors, with the danger to their property. The senators felt, moreover, a public solicitude that the consul, by his donation, was establishing an influence dangerous to liberty. Then, for the first time, the agrarian law was proposed, which, even down to our own recollection, was never agitated without the greatest commotions in the state. The other consul resisted the donation, the senators seconding him. Nor were all the common people opposed to him. They had at first begun to despise a gift that was extended from citizens to allies. In the next place, they frequently heard Consul Virginius in the assemblies, as it were, prophesying that the gift of his colleague was pestilential, that those lands were sure to bring slavery to those who should receive them, that the way was paving to a throne. For why were the allies included, and the Latin nation? What was the object of 1/3 of the land that had been taken being given back to the Hernici, so lately our enemies, except that instead of Coriolanus being their leader, they might have Cassius? The dissuader and opposer of the agrarian law now began to be popular. Both consuls then vied with each other in humoring the common people. Virginius said that he would suffer the lands to be assigned, provided they were assigned to no one but a Roman citizen. Cassius, because in the agrarian donation he sought popularity among the allies, and was therefore lowered in the estimation of his countrymen, in order that by another donation he might conciliate their affections, ordered that the money received for the Sicilian corn should be refunded to the people. That, indeed, the people rejected as nothing else than a present bribe for regal authority. So strongly were his gifts spurned in the minds of men, as if they possessed everything in abundance, in consequence of their inveterate suspicions of his aiming at sovereign power. As soon as he left office, it is certain that he was condemned and put to death. There are some who represent his father as the person who inflicted the punishment, that he, having tried him at home, scourged him and put him to death, and consecrated his son's private property to Ceres. Out of this a statue was set up and inscribed, given from the Cassian family. In some authors I find it stated, and that is more probable, that a day of trial was assigned to him for high treason by the quaestors, Caeso Fabius and Lucius Valerius, and that he was condemned by the decision of the people. That his house was demolished by a public decree. This is the area before the temple of Tellus. But whether that trial was private or public, he was condemned in the consulship of Servius Cornelius and Quintus Fabius. The resentment of the people against Cassius was not of long duration. The allurements of the agrarian law, now that its proposer was gone, were of themselves gaining ground in their minds. This feeling was further heightened by the parsimonious conduct of the senators, who, after the Volsci and Equi had been defeated that year, defrauded the soldiers of the booty. Whatever was taken from the enemy, Consul Fabius sold and lodged the proceeds in the treasury. The Fabian name was odious to the common people on account of the last consul. The Senate, however, succeeded in having Caeso Fabius elected consul with Lucius Aemilius. The common people, still further incensed at this, stirred up foreign war by exciting disturbance at home. Civil dissensions were then interrupted by war. The senators and common people, uniting under the conduct of Aemilius, conquered in battle the Volsci and Equi, who renewed hostilities. The retreat, however, destroyed more of the enemy than the battle itself, so perseveringly did the cavalry pursue them when routed. During the same year, on the Ides of July, the Temple of Castor was dedicated. It had been vowed during the Latin War in the dictatorship of Postumius. His son, who was elected duumvir for that special purpose, dedicated it. In that year, also, the minds of the people were excited by the charms of the agrarian law. The tribunes of the people were for enhancing the popular power vested in them by promoting the popular law. The senators, considering that there was enough, and more than enough, of frenzy in the multitude without any additional incitement, viewed with horror largesses and all inducements to temerity. The senators found in the consuls most energetic abettors in making resistance. That portion of the commonwealth therefore prevailed, and not for the present only, but for the forthcoming year. They succeeded in bringing in Marcus Fabius, Ciso's brother, as consul, and one still more detested by the common people for his persecution of Spurius Cassius, Lucius Valerius. In that year also there was a contest with the tribunes. The law proved to be a vain project, and the abettors of the law mere boasters, by their holding out a gift that was not realized. The Fabian name was from thence held in high repute, after 3 successive consulships, all, as it were, uniformly exercised in contending with the tribunes. Accordingly, the honor remained for a considerable time in that family, as being right well placed. A Vaentian war was then commenced. The Volscians, too, renewed hostilities. But for foreign wars, their strength was almost more than sufficient, and they abused it by contending among themselves. To the distracted state of the public mind were added prodigies from heaven, exhibiting almost daily threats in the city and in the country. The soothsayers, consulted by the state and by private individuals, one while by means of entrails, another by birds, declared that there was no other cause for the divine anger, but that the ceremonies of religion were not duly attended to. These terrors, however, terminated in this: Oppia, a Vestal virgin, being found guilty of a breach of chastity, was made to suffer punishment. Quintus Fabius and Gaius Julius were then made consuls. During this year, the dissension at home was not abated, and the war abroad was more desperate. Arms were taken up by the Equins. The Vaentes also entered the territory of the Romans, committing devastations. The solicitude about these wars increased, and Ciso Fabius and Spurius Furius were created consuls. The Equi were laying siege to Ortona, a Latin city. The Vaentes, now satiated with plunder, threatened that they would besiege Rome itself. These terrors, when they ought to assuage, increased still further the bad feelings of the common people. The custom of declining military service was now returning, not of their own accord, but Spurius Licinius, a tribune of the people, thinking that the time had come for forcing the agrarian law on the patricians by extreme necessity, had taken on him the task of obstructing military preparations. But all the odium of the tribunician power was turned on the author. Nor did the consuls rise up against him more zealously than his own colleagues. By their assistance, the consuls held the levy. An army was raised for the 2 wars at the same time. One was given to Fabius to be led against the Equi, the other to Furius against the Vaentians. With respect to the Vaentians, nothing was done worthy of mention. Fabius had much more trouble with his countrymen than with the enemy. That one man himself, as consul, sustained the commonwealth, which the army was betraying, as far as they lay, through their hatred of the consul. For when the consul, in addition to his other military talents, which he exhibited amply in his preparations for in conduct of war, had so drawn up his line that he routed the enemy's army solely by a charge of his cavalry, the infantry refused to pursue them when routed. And though the exhortation of their general, whom they hated, could not move them, neither could even their own infamy, and the present public disgrace and subsequent danger, if the enemy should recover courage, oblige them to quicken their pace, or even to stand in order of battle, if nothing else. Without orders they faced about, and with a sorrowful air, you would suppose them beaten, they returned to the camp, executing at one time their general, at another time the services rendered by the cavalry. Nor were any remedies sought by the general for this so pestilent an example. So true is it that the most distinguished talents are more likely to be deficient in the tact of managing their countrymen than in that of conquering an enemy. The consul returned to Rome, not having so much increased his military glory as irritated and exasperated the hatred of his soldiers towards him. The patricians, however, succeeded in having the consulship remain in the Fabian family. They elected Marcus Fabius consul. Gnaeus Manlius was assigned as a colleague to Fabius. This year also brought a tribune as a proposer of the agrarian law, Titus Pontificius. He, pursuing the same course as that which seemed to succeed with Spurius Licinius, obstructed the levy for a little time. The patricians, once more perplexed, heard Appius Claudius assert that the tribunician power was put down last year. He argued that it was put down for the present by the very act, and for the future by the precedent established. Since it was found that it could be rendered ineffective by its own strength, he believed there would never be wanting a tribune who would both be willing to obtain a victory for himself over his colleague, and the favor of the better party by advancing the public weal. He also stated that a plurality of tribunes, if needed, would be ready to assist the consuls, and that even one would be sufficient against all. He urged only that the consuls and leading members of the Senate take care to gain over, if not all, at least some of the tribunes, to the Commonwealth and the Senate. The senators, convinced by Appius's counsels, both collectively addressed the tribunes with kindness and civility. The men of consular rank, each according to his personal influence, partly by conciliation, partly by authority, prevailed so far as to make them consent that the powers of the tribunician office should be beneficial to the state. And by the aid of 4 tribunes against one obstructive of the public good, the consuls completed the levy. They then set out to the Veientian War, to which auxiliaries had flocked from all parts of Etruria. These were collected not so much for the sake of the Veientians, as because they had formed a hope that the Roman state might be destroyed by internal discord. In the councils of all the states of Etruria, the leading men openly stated that Roman power was eternal, unless they were distracted by internal disturbances. That this was the only poison, this the bane discovered for powerful states, to render great empires mortal. That this evil, long retarded, partly by the wise measures of the patricians, partly by the forbearance of the common people, had now proceeded to extremities. 2 states, they claimed, were now formed out of one, with each party having its own magistrates and its own laws. They argued that though at first the Roman populace was accustomed to be turbulent during the levies, still these same individuals had ever been obedient to their commanders during war. With military discipline retained, no matter the state of the city, it had been possible to withstand the evil. But now, they said, the custom of not obeying their superior followed the Roman soldier even to the camp. In the last war, in the very field, in the very heat of battle, by consent of the army, victory was voluntarily surrendered to the vanquished equi. The standards were deserted, the general abandoned on the field, and the army had returned to the camp without orders. They concluded that, without doubt, if perseverance were used, Rome might be conquered by her own soldiers. Nothing else was necessary, they believed, than to declare and make a show of war. The fates and the gods would themselves manage the rest. These hopes had armed the Etrurians, who in many vicissitudes had been both vanquished and victors. The Roman consuls also dreaded nothing else than their own strength and their own arms. The recollection of the destructive precedent set in the last war deterred them from bringing matters to such a pass that they should have to fear 2 armies at the same time. Accordingly, they kept within their camp, avoiding this double danger, hoping that delay and time itself would soften resentment and bring a right way of thinking to their minds. The Veientian enemy and the Etrurians proceeded with much greater precipitation. They provoked the Romans to battle, first riding up to the camp and challenging them. At length, when they produced no effect by reviling the consuls themselves as well as the army, they stated that the pretense of internal dissension was assumed as a cloak for this cowardice. They claimed the consuls distrusted as much the courage as the obedience of their soldiers. Silence and inaction among armed men, they declared, were a novel form of sedition. Besides this, they threw out reproaches, both true and false, on the upstart quality of their race and origin. While these reproaches vociferated beneath the very rampart and gates, the consuls bore them without impatience. But at one time indignation, at another time shame, distracted the breasts of the ignorant multitude and diverted their attention from internal evils. They were unwilling that the enemy should come off unpunished. They were unwilling that success should accrue to the patricians or the consuls. Foreign and domestic hatred struggled for mastery in their breasts. At length the former prevailed, so haughtily and insolently did the enemy revile them. They crowded in a body to the general's tent, demanding battle, requiring that the signal be given. The consuls conferred together as if to deliberate. They continued the conference for a long time. They were desirous of fighting, but that desire had to be checked and concealed, so that by opposition and delay they might increase the ardor of the soldiery once roused. An answer was returned, that the matter in question was premature, that it was not yet time for fighting, and that they should keep within their camp. They then issued a proclamation that they should abstain from fighting, and that if anyone fought without orders, they should punish him as an enemy. When they were thus dismissed, their eagerness for fighting increased in proportion as they thought that the consuls were less disposed to it. The enemies, moreover, approached much more insolently, as soon as it was known that the consuls had determined not to fight. For they supposed that they might insult them with impunity, that their arms were not entrusted to the soldiery, that the matter would explode in a violent mutiny, and that a termination had come to the Roman Empire. Relying on these hopes, they ran up to the gates, heaped reproaches on them, and with difficulty refrained from assaulting the camp. Now indeed, the Romans could no longer endure these insults. They crowded from every quarter of the camp to the consuls. They no longer, as formerly, made their demand with reserve, through the mediation of the centurions of the first rank, but all proceeded indiscriminately with loud clamors. The affair was now ripe, still they put it off. Fabius then, his colleague giving way in consequence of his dread of mutiny now augmented by the uproar, after he had commanded silence by sound of trumpet, said, "That these men are able to conquer, Gnaeus Manlius, I know. That they are willing, they themselves have prevented me from knowing. It is therefore resolved and determined not to give the signal, unless they swear that they will return victorious from this battle. The soldier has once deceived the Roman consul in the field. The gods he never will deceive." There was a centurion, Marcus Flavelius, one of the foremost in demanding battle. He said, "Marcus Fabius, I will return victorious from the field." If he deceived, he invoked the anger of Father Jove, Mars Gradivus, and of the other gods. After him, the entire army severally took the same oath. The signal was given to them when sworn. They took up arms, went into battle, full of rage and of hope. They bade the Etrurians now to cast their reproaches. They severally required that the enemy, once so ready with the tongue, should now stand before them armed as they were. On that day the bravery of all, both common people and patricians, was extraordinary. The Fabian name, the Fabian race, shone forth most conspicuously. They were determined to recover in that battle the affections of the common people, which during many civil contests had been alienated from them. The line of battle was formed, nor did the Vaentian foe and the Etrurian legions decline the contest. An almost certain hope was entertained that they would no more fight with them than they had done with the Equi, that even some more serious attempt was not to be despaired of, considering the irritated state of their feelings and the very critical occasion. The affair turned out altogether differently, for never before in any other war did the Roman soldiers enter the field with more determined minds. So much had the enemy exasperated them by taunts on the one hand, and the consuls by delay on the other. The Etrurians had scarcely time to form their ranks when the javelins, having been thrown away at random in the first hurry, rather than discharged with aim, the battle had now come to close fighting, even to swords, where the fury of war is most desperate. Among the foremost, the Fabian family was distinguished for the sight it afforded and the example it presented to their fellow citizens. One of these, Quintus Fabius, who had been consul 2 years before, as he was advancing at the head of his men against a dense body of Vaentians, and while engaged amid numerous parties of the enemy, and therefore not prepared for it, was transfixed with a sword through the breast by a Tuscan who presumed on his bodily strength and skill in arms. On the weapon being extracted, Fabius fell forward on the wound. Both armies felt the fall of this one man, and the Roman began in consequence to give way, when the consul Marcus Fabius leaped over the body as it lay. Holding up his buckler, he said, "Is this what you swore, soldiers, that you would return to the camp in flight? Are you thus more afraid of your most dastardly enemies than of Jupiter and Mars, by whom you have sworn? But I, who have not sworn, will either return victorious or will fall fighting here beside thee, Quintus Fabius." Then Ciso Fabius, the consul of the preceding year, said to the consul, "Brother, is it by these words you think you will prevail on them to fight? The gods by whom they have sworn will prevail on them. Let us also, as men of noble birth, as is worthy of the Fabian name, enkindle the courage of the soldiers by fighting rather than by exhorting." Thus the two Fabii rushed forward to the front with presented spears, and brought on with them the whole line. The battle being restored on one side, Gnaeus Manlius, the consul, with no less ardor, encouraged the fight on the other wing. An almost similar result took place, for as the soldiers undauntedly followed Quintus Fabius on the one wing, so did they follow Manlius on this, as he was driving the enemy now nearly routed. When he, having received a severe wound, retired from the battle, they fell back, supposing that he was slain, and would have given way, had not the other consul, galloping at full speed to that quarter with some troops of horse, supported their drooping energies, crying out that his colleague was still alive, and that he himself had now come victorious, having routed the other wing. Manlius also showed himself to restore the battle. The well-known voices of the two consuls rekindled the courage of the soldiers. At the same time, too, the enemy's line was now weakened. Relying on their superior numbers, they drew off their reserve and sent them to storm the camp. This being assaulted without much resistance, while they lost time in attending to plunder rather than to fighting, the Roman triarii, who had not been able to sustain the first shock, having sent an account to the consuls of the present position of affairs, returned in a compact body to the praetorium, and of themselves renewed the battle. Consul Manlius also, having returned to the camp and posted soldiers at all the gates, had blocked up every passage against the enemy. This desperate situation aroused the fury, rather than the bravery of the Etrurians. For when rushing on wherever hope held out the prospect of escape, they had frequently advanced with fruitless efforts. One body of young men made an attack on the consul himself, conspicuous from his arms. The first weapons were intercepted by those who stood around him. Afterwards, their force could not be sustained. The consul fell, having received a mortal wound, and all around him were dispersed. The courage of the Etrurians rose. Terror drove the Romans in dismay through the entire camp, and matters would have come to an end, had not the lieutenant generals, hastily seizing the body of the consul, opened a passage for the enemy at one gate. Through this they rushed out, and going away in the utmost disorder, they fell in with the other consul who had been victorious. There again they were slain and routed in every direction. A glorious victory was obtained, saddened however by two such illustrious deaths. The consul, therefore, on the Senate voting him a triumph, replied that if the army could triumph without their general, he would readily accede to it in consideration of their distinguished behavior in that war. That for his own part, his family being plunged in grief in consequence of the death of his brother Quintus Fabius, and the Commonwealth being in some degree bereaved by the loss of one of her consuls, he would not accept the laurel blasted by public and private grief. The triumph thus resigned was more distinguished than any triumph actually enjoyed. So true is it that glory refused in due season sometimes returns with accumulated luster. He next celebrated the two funerals of his colleague and brother, one after the other, he himself acting as panegyrist in the case of both. By ascribing to them his own deserts, he himself obtained the greatest share of them, and not unmindful of that which he had conceived at the commencement of his consulship, namely, the regaining the affection of the people, he distributed the wounded soldiers among the patricians to be cured. Most of them were given to the Fabii, nor were they treated with greater attention in any other place. From this time, the Fabii began to be popular, and that not by any practices except such as were beneficial to the state. Chapter 7. the Fabian War and the Veientian threat. Ciso Fabius, elected consul alongside T. Virginius, prioritized unity. He sought to reconcile the plebeians and senators. Early in his term, Fabius proposed that patricians distribute conquered land among the common people, arguing it was justly theirs, earned by their toil and blood. The patricians, however, scorned this idea, some even suggesting Fabius's once brilliant mind was now clouded by excessive glory. Meanwhile, the Latins faced incursions from the Equi. Fabius led an army into Equian territory, but the Equi retreated within their walled towns, avoiding direct conflict. A setback occurred when the other consul's recklessness led to a defeat against the Veientians, an army saved only by Fabius's timely intervention. From then on, the conflict with the Veientians became a peculiar state of neither full peace nor outright war. They behaved like brigands, retreating to their city when Roman troops approached, then raiding the countryside once the Romans withdrew. This constant harassment, though rarely posing a major threat, prevented Rome from focusing on other looming conflicts with the Equi, Volsci, and Sabines. At this point, the Fabian family addressed the Senate. The consul, speaking for his family, declared, "Conscript fathers, the Veientian War requires constant vigilance rather than overwhelming force. Focus on other conflicts. Assign the Fabii as the Veientians' sole adversaries. We pledge to safeguard Rome's honor in that quarter. This war, as a family endeavor, we will finance ourselves. Spare the Republic at the expense of soldiers and funds here." The Senate offered their warmest thanks. The consul, accompanied by the assembled Fabii, returned home, instructing them to gather, armed, at his gate the following day. News of the Fabii's pledge spread throughout the city, drawing immense praise. People lauded the family for shouldering the state's burden, calling the Veientian War a private cause. Many wished for other families to similarly take on the Volsci or Equi, allowing Rome to enjoy profound peace. The next day the Fabii, 306 patrician soldiers, all from the same lineage, marched forth. Their unified presence, promising destruction to VI, drew a crowd of kinsmen, friends, and concerned citizens. All offered prayers as the Fabii passed sacred sites, wishing them prosperity, success, and a safe return. These prayers, however, proved futile. The Fabii, taking an ill-omened route, reached the Cremera River, where they established a fortified post. L. Emilius and C. Servilius were then elected consuls. For a time, the Fabii not only defended their garrison, but also protected Roman lands and ravaged enemy territory, extending their reach along both frontiers. A brief pause in hostilities followed. The Veientians, reinforced by an army from Etruria, assaulted the Cremera post. Simultaneously, a Roman army led by Consul L. Emilius engaged the Etrurians in open battle. The Veientians, caught off guard by a sudden cavalry charge, were routed before they could fully form their lines. Driven back to the Red Rocks, they sued for peace, a decision they regretted before the Roman garrison at Cremera was even withdrawn. Hostilities resumed, with the Veientians again facing the Fabii directly. Numerous clashes, even pitched battles, occurred, and often, this single Roman family triumphed over the powerful Etrurian state. The Veientians, initially mortified, devised a plan to lure the overconfident Fabii into an ambush. They began to leave cattle unattended in abandoned fields, creating the illusion of easy plunder. Armed patrols, sent to deter Roman raiders, would feign retreat, further bolstering the Fabii's arrogance. The Fabii, now convinced of their invincibility, pursued what appeared to be stray cattle across an open plain near Cremera. Unaware of the danger, they rushed past ambuscades hidden on either side of the road. As they scattered to round up the frightened livestock, the Veientians sprang from their hiding places, surrounding the Romans. A sudden shout of alarm gave way to a hail of weapons. Hemmed in by the Etrurians, the Fabii were forced to contract their formation, revealing their small numbers against the overwhelming enemy. Shifting their focus, they massed their forces and, forming a wedge, fought their way to a nearby hill. There, they briefly found respite and repelled the initial Etrurian advance. The smaller Roman force, using the advantage of higher ground, began to gain the upper hand until a flanking party of Veientians reached the summit, again giving the enemy the advantage. Every last Fabius was killed, and the fort was taken. 306 perished. Only one young Fabius, almost of age, survived, destined to become a vital support to the Roman people in future crises. During this disaster, c. Horatius and T. Menenius served as consuls. Menenius was immediately dispatched to confront the victorious Etrurians, but suffered another defeat. The enemy captured the Janiculum Hill, threatening to besiege Rome and cause a famine, as they had crossed the Tiber. Only the recall of Consul Horatius from the Volsci saved the city. Battles were fought near the Temple of Hope and the Colline Gate, slowly restoring Roman morale. Aulus Virginius and S.P. Servilius was then elected consuls. The Veientians, shaken by their previous losses, avoided direct engagement. Instead, they launched raids from the Janiculum, pillaging Roman territory and endangering farmers and livestock. They were eventually caught in a trap similar to the one they had set for the Fabii. Pursuing cattle deliberately used as a decoy, they fell into an ambush, and their greater numbers only led to a larger slaughter. This defeat ignited a greater fury, leading to a more significant disaster. The Veientians crossed the Tiber by night, attempting to assault Consul Servilius's camp. They were repelled with heavy losses and barely retreated to the Janiculum. Servilius, pursuing them, established his camp at the base of the hill. The next morning, emboldened by the previous day's success and pressed by dwindling food supplies, he rashly led his army up the steep slope toward the enemy's camp. He was repulsed even more disgracefully than the Veientians had been, saved only by his colleagues' intervention. Caught between two Roman armies, the Etrurians were completely annihilated. Thus, the Veientian War was brought to an end by a fortunate act of daring. With peace restored, abundant provisions returned to the city, both from Campania and from previously hoarded grain. With external threats quelled, the people's minds, now at ease, turned inward. The tribunes revived grievances, specifically the agrarian law, inciting the common people against opposing senators, both as a body and as individuals. Q. Considius and T. Janutius, proponents of the agrarian law, brought charges against T. Menenius. He was accused of losing the fort at Cremera while his army was stationed nearby. Despite fervent support from the senators, reminiscent of their defense of Coriolanus, and the enduring popularity of his father Agrippa, Menenius was found guilty. However, the tribunes only imposed a fine of 2,000 asses, rather than the capital punishment they had sought. This proved fatal, as Menenius, unable to bear the disgrace and anguish, reportedly died of illness. Soon after, another senator, S.P. Servilius, faced similar charges as he left office. Accused by tribunes L. Caedicius and T. Statius, Servilius met their attacks not with supplication, but with unwavering confidence in his integrity and influence. The charge against him concerned the battle with the Etrurians at the Janiculum. Servilius, a man of courage, confronted the danger head-on. He boldly refuted not only the tribunes but also the common people, rebuking them for the condemnation and death of T. Menenius, whose father's goodwill had once re-established the commons and granted them the very laws and magistrates they now used so insolently. His colleague, Virginius, also supported him as a witness, attributing to Servilius a share of his own accomplishments. Ultimately, Menenius's condemnation greatly aided Servilius, demonstrating how public opinion could shift. With domestic disputes momentarily settled, a new Veientian War erupted, with the Sabines allied against Rome. Consul P. Valerius, reinforced by Latin and Hernician auxiliaries, marched to Veii. He immediately attacked the Sabine camp, which lay outside the city walls. The assault caused such panic that, as the Sabines scattered to defend themselves, the Romans breached the gate. What followed was a massacre, not a battle, within the ramparts. Alarm spread to Veii. The Veientians armed themselves in a panic, as if their city had already fallen. Some rushed to aid the Sabines, while others engaged the Romans, who were focused on the camp. The Romans were briefly thrown into disarray, but quickly formed two fronts. A cavalry charge, ordered by the consul, routed the Etrurians. In a single hour, two armies in two powerful neighboring states were defeated. While this unfolded at Veii, the Volsci and Equi had encamped in Latin territory and ravaged their borders. The Latins, with the help of the Hernicians, but without Roman leadership or troops, successfully drove them from their camp. They recovered their own property and seized immense booty. Nevertheless, Consul C. Mucius was dispatched from Rome against the Volsci. It seems the Romans disapproved of allies waging wars independently. The Volsci endured every indignity, but consistently refused open battle. Lucius Furius and Caius Manlius assumed the consulship. Manlius was assigned the Veientian province. No war ensued. The Veientians requested and were granted a 40-year truce, agreeing to supply corn and pay for the Roman soldiers. Peace abroad quickly gave way to strife at home. The tribunes once again agitated the common people with calls for agrarian law. The consuls, undeterred by Menenius's condemnation or Servilius's peril, fiercely resisted. As they left office, C.N. Janutius, a tribune of the people, brought charges against them. Lucius Aemilius and Opiter Virginius, or Vopiscus Julius according to some annals, became the next consuls. During this year, Furius and Manlius, summoned for trial, sought support from both the common people and younger patricians. They warned against seeking public office, claiming consular honors. The fasces, the purple-bordered toga, the curule chair, were mere trappings of death. They argued that the consulship was now captive to tribunician power, forcing consuls to act as mere agents of the tribunes. Any defiance, any appeal to the patricians, or any acknowledgement of a party other than the common people would lead to the fate of Caius Marcius's exile or Menenius's condemnation and death. These warnings spurred the patricians to hold private, secretive consultations. They agreed that the accused must be saved by any means necessary. The most desperate proposals found favor, and willing actors for daring deeds were not lacking. On the day of the trial, as the people gathered anxiously in the forum, they were surprised by the tribune's absence. As the delay grew suspicious, they concluded he had been intimidated by the nobles, complaining that their cause was abandoned. Finally, those waiting at the tribune's residence reported that he had been found dead in his house. The news spread like wildfire, scattering the assembly as an army disperses upon the fall of its general. The tribunes were seized with panic, realizing the limited protection offered by their sacred laws. The patricians, however, could not contain their joy. Far from feeling remorse, even the innocent wished to be credited with the act, openly declaring that tribunician power would be crushed by force. Immediately after this victory, a levy was proclaimed. With the tribunes now intimidated, the consuls proceeded unopposed. This, more than the consul's command, enraged the common people. They declared their liberty was over, that they had returned to their old servitude, and that tribunician power had died with Janutius. They vowed to find new ways to resist the patricians, believing the people must now defend themselves. They noted the consul's 24 lictors were themselves commoners, asserting that these symbols of authority were powerless if only people chose to defy them. Incited by these discussions, a lictor was dispatched by the consuls to Valero Publilius, a commoner who had asserted that, as a centurion, he should not be forced into the ranks of a common soldier. Valero appealed to the tribunes. When one came to his aid, the consuls ordered Valero stripped and prepared for flogging. "I appeal to the people," cried Valero, "since tribunes would rather see a Roman citizen scourged before their eyes than be butchered in their own beds." The more vehemently he protested, the more violently the lictor tore at his clothes. But Valero, a man of great physical strength, and aided by his supporters, repelled the lictor. Amidst intense shouts of indignation, he plunged into the thickest part of the crowd, crying, "I appeal and implore the protection of the commons. Assist me, fellow citizens. Assist me, fellow soldiers. There is no use waiting for the tribunes. They themselves need your aid." The crowd, highly agitated, prepared for battle. It became clear that grave danger loomed, that nothing would be held sacred, and that all public and private rights were imperiled. Confronting this violent storm, the consuls quickly realized that authority without strength offered little security. Their lictors were manhandled, their fasces broken, and they were driven from the forum into the Senate house, uncertain how far Valero would press his victory. As the commotion subsided, the consuls convened the Senate. They complained of the assaults against them, the violence of the people, and Valero's audacity. Many extreme measures were proposed, but the elder senators prevailed, advocating against meeting the commons' rashness with patrician fury. The common people, having strongly embraced Valero's cause, enthusiastically elected him tribune of the people for the following year, when Lucius Pinarius and Publius Furius were consuls. Contrary to expectations that he would harass the preceding year's consuls, Valero put public interest before private resentment. Without a single word against the consuls, he proposed a law that plebeian magistrates should be elected by tribal assembly. This was a matter of no small consequence, though it initially seemed harmless. In reality, it stripped the patricians of their power to elect tribunes through the votes of their clients. The patricians resisted this popular proposition with all their might. Though none of the tribunes could be persuaded by consular or senatorial influence to interpose a veto, the only remaining means of opposition, the weight of the issue itself prolonged the contention until the following year. The commons re-elected Valero as tribune. The senators, anticipating a bitter struggle, elected Appius Claudius, son of Appius, who was both hated by and hated by the common people, to the consulship. Titus Quintius was assigned as his colleague. At the very start of the year, the proposed law took precedence over all other matters. Although Valero initiated it, his colleague Litorius proved a more recent and more energetic advocate. While Valero focused on the law, avoiding personal attacks on the consuls, Litorius began by denouncing Appius and his family as perpetually overbearing and cruel towards the Roman commons. He argued that Appius had been elected not as a consul, but as an executioner to torment the people. Litorius, a military man, found his rough tongue insufficient to express his outrage. Lacking further words, he declared, "Romans, since I do not speak as readily as I act upon my words, gather here tomorrow. I will either die before your eyes or pass this law." The next day, the tribunes took possession of the temple. The consuls and nobles positioned themselves in the assembly to obstruct the law. Litorius ordered all non-voters to leave. The young nobles, however, definitely held their ground. Litorius then ordered some of them seized. Consul Appius insisted that the tribune had no jurisdiction over anyone but a plebeian, stating he was a magistrate of the commons only, not the general populace. Appius argued that even he, by ancestral custom, could not remove anyone by virtue of his authority, as the traditional words were, "If you think proper, depart, Romans." Appius's fluent and contemptuous argument concerning legal rights flustered Litorius. Burning with rage, the tribune sent his attendant to the consul. The consul, in turn, sent his lictor to the tribune, proclaiming him a private individual without power or magistracy. Litorius would have been roughly handled had not the entire assembly passionately risen in support of the tribune against the consul. A surge of excited citizens from across the city poured into the forum. Appius, however, stubbornly withstood this great storm. The conflict would have escalated into a bloody battle had not Quintius, the other consul, entrusted men of consular rank with forcibly removing his colleague from the forum, if necessary. Quintius then assuaged the enraged people with pleas, imploring the tribunes to dismiss the assembly. He urged them to allow their passion to cool, stating that delay would not diminish their power but would add prudence to strength, and that the senators would be brought under the control of the people, and the consul under that of the senators. Quintius eventually pacified the people, though persuading his colleague, Appius, proved much more difficult for the patricians. With the assembly finally dismissed, the consuls convened the Senate. Though fear and resentment had initially produced diverse opinions, as time passed and reflection replaced violent emotion, they grew increasingly averse to continuing the dispute. They even thanked Quintius for quelling the disturbance. Appius was urged to ensure that consular dignity remained within the bounds of a peacefully run state. It was argued that as long as tribunes and consuls each pulled all power to their own side, no strength remained in the middle, and the true aim became seizing control of a distracted and torn commonwealth, rather than ensuring its safety. Appius, however, called upon gods and men to witness that the commonwealth was being betrayed and abandoned through cowardice. He claimed it was not the consul who failed the Senate, but the Senate who failed the consul, and that they were now submitting to more oppressive laws than those established on the Sacred Mount. Overwhelmed by the unanimous sentiment of the senators, he finally relented, and the law was passed without opposition. Now, for the first time, tribunes were elected in the tribal assembly. Piso records that their number increased from 2 to 5. Caius Sicinius, Lucius Numitorius, Marcus Duilius, Spurius Icilius, and Lucius Massilius. During these domestic struggles, a war erupted with the Volscians and Equians. They had ravaged Roman lands, hoping to offer refuge to any seceding Roman citizens. When the internal disputes settled, the enemy withdrew their camp. Appius Claudius was sent against the Volscians, while Quintius took command against the Equians. Appius's harshness in war mirrored his severity at home, now unchecked by tribunician authority. His hatred for the common people, inherited and inflamed by his recent political defeat, fueled his rigorous command. However, the army, imbued with a spirit of opposition, could not be subdued. They executed every order slowly, negligently, and with stubborn defiance. Neither shame nor fear swayed them. If Appius demanded speed, they moved slower. If he encouraged them, they ceased their efforts. They cursed him silently as he passed, a reaction that even moved his mind, usually impervious to plebeian hatred. After all harsh measures failed, he ceased interacting with the soldiers, claiming the army was corrupted by centurions, sarcastically calling them tribunes of the people, or valeros. The Volscians were well aware of these tensions and pressed their advantage, hoping the Roman army would oppose Appius as fiercely as they had once opposed Fabius. But their animosity towards Appius was far greater. They not only refused to win, they desired defeat. When led into battle, they fled ignominiously back to camp, only standing their ground when the Volscians began to devastate their rear. Compelled to fight to dislodge the victorious enemy from their lines, it was clear the Roman soldiers only resisted their camp being taken. Some even reveled in their own defeat and disgrace. Appius, undaunted, sought to impose further severity and summoned an assembly. But his lieutenants and tribunes flocked around him, advising against testing an authority that relied entirely on obedience. They reported that soldiers refused to attend the assembly, their shouts demanding the camp be moved from Volscian territory. The victorious enemy had almost breached their ramparts, presenting a clear threat of disaster. Yielding at last, since delay would only postpone punishment, Appius adjourned the assembly. He ordered a march for the next day, and at dawn, gave the signal to depart. As the army began to clear the camp, the Volscians, alerted by the same signal, attacked the rear. The alarm spread to the vanguard, throwing battalions and ranks into such confusion that commands were unheard. Lines could not be formed, and all thought only of flight. They stumbled through heaps of dead bodies and weapons, fleeing so frantically that the enemy ceased pursuit before the Romans stopped running. Collecting his scattered forces in a peaceful area, Appius, after vainly attempting to rally them, convened an assembly. He rightfully denounced the army as traitors to military discipline and deserters. He questioned individual soldiers about their standards and weapons. He then had those who had thrown down their arms, standard-bearers who had lost their standards, centurions, and those with double allowances who had deserted their ranks, scourged and beheaded. For the rest of the multitude, every 10th man was chosen by lot for punishment. In stark contrast, the consul Quintius and his soldiers in Equian territory vied with each other in courtesy and kindness. Quintius was naturally milder, and his colleagues' ill-fated severity encouraged his good temper. This profound harmony between general and army deterred the Equians from engaging. They allowed the Romans to devastate their lands, suffering greater depredations than in any previous war. Praise was also given, a reward soldiers found as gratifying as plunder. The army returned reconciled to both their general and, through him, to the patricians, declaring that the Senate had given them a father, but given the other army a master. The year, marked by varied military fortunes and furious domestic and foreign strife, was chiefly remembered for the tribal elections. The victory in this contest held more symbolic importance than real advantage, for the exclusion of patricians diminished the dignity of the elections themselves, more than it increased the influence of the common people or reduced that of the patricians. A more turbulent year followed, with Lucius Valerius and Tiberius Aemilius as consuls. It was dominated by struggles over agrarian law and the trial of Appius Claudius. As the law's fiercest opponent and a staunch defender of public landholders, Appius, acting almost as a third consul, was charged by tribunes Marcus Duilius and Caius Sicinius. Never before had such a hated accused been brought before the people, overwhelmed by resentment for both himself and his father. The patricians, too, rarely exerted themselves so greatly for any one, seeing him as the Senate's champion, exposed to the fury of the tribunes and commons simply for exceeding limits in the conflict. Appius Claudius alone among the patricians made light of the tribunes, the common people, and his own trial. Neither the threats of the commons nor the pleas of the Senate could persuade him to change his dress, act as a suppliant, or soften his usual harsh demeanor when pleading his case. His expression remained the same, his gaze unwavering, his language filled with the same proud spirit. Many commoners felt as much awe for Appius on trial as they had when he was consul. He pleaded his case once, with the same accusatory spirit he always adopted. He so astounded the tribunes and commons with his intrepidity that they voluntarily postponed the trial, allowing the matter to drag on. Before the rescheduled day arrived, however, he died of an illness. When the tribunes attempted to impede his funeral eulogy, the common people would not allow such a great man's final honors to be denied. They listened to his eulogy with the same patience they had shown to charges against him while living, and attended his funeral in vast numbers. In the same year, Consul Valerius led an army against the Equians. Unable to lure the enemy into battle, he assaulted their camp. A violent storm of thunder and hail from heaven halted the attack. When the signal for retreat was given, the sudden return of fair weather astonished them, making them reluctant to attack a camp seemingly defended by divine power. All the fury of war then turned to devastating the land. The other consul, Aemilius, waged war against the Sabines. There too, because the enemy remained within their walls, the lands were ravaged. When the burning of not only country houses but also thickly inhabited villages finally roused the Sabines, they engaged the Roman raiders. After an indecisive battle, they retreated to a safer position the next day. This seemed sufficient reason for the consul to consider the enemy conquered, and he departed, leaving the war unfinished. During these wars, while domestic dissensions continued, Titus Nemesius Priscus and Aulus Virginius were elected consuls. The common people seemed determined to no longer tolerate delays regarding the agrarian law, and extreme violence was imminent. However, news arrived from burning country houses and fleeing peasants that the Volscians were at hand. This checked the burgeoning sedition. The consuls, immediately ordered to war by the Senate, led the city's youth forth, quieting the rest of the common people. The enemy, having merely created alarm, swiftly retreated. Nemesius marched to Antium against the Volscians, Virginius against the Equians. Here, a major defeat was narrowly averted after an ambush. The soldiers' bravery restored Roman superiority, which had been imperiled by the consul's carelessness. The general's conduct against the Volscians was more successful. The enemy was routed in the first engagement and forced to flee into the wealthy city of Antium. The consul, not daring to attack Antium, captured Seno, another, less prosperous, Volscian town. While the Equians and Volscians occupied the Roman armies, the Sabines advanced their devastations even to the city gates. A few days later, however, the two Roman consuls, now enraged, entered Sabine territory and inflicted heavier losses than they had sustained. Towards the close of the year, there was some peace, but, as often happened, it was disturbed by conflicts between patricians and commoners. The exasperated commoners refused to participate in the consular elections. Titus Quintius and Quintus Servilius were elected consuls by the patricians and their dependents. Their year mirrored the preceding one, an embroiled beginning, followed by tranquility due to foreign wars. The Sabines, moving rapidly across the plains of Cristomenum, brought fire and sword along the banks of the Anio. Repulsed near the Colline Gate and city walls, they nevertheless carried off a great deal of plunder, both people and cattle. Consul Servilius pursued them with a determined army, but could not catch their main force in the open country. However, he ravaged their territory so extensively, leaving nothing untouched by war, that he returned with far more plunder than the enemy had taken. Public interests were also well supported against the Volscians by the efforts of both generals and soldiers. First, they fought a pitched battle on equal ground, with great slaughter and bloodshed on both sides. The Romans, whose fewer numbers made losses more keenly felt, would have given way had not the consul, with a timely deception, reanimated the army by shouting that the enemy were fleeing on the other wing. Charging forward, believing they were victorious, they became so. Fearing that pressing too far might renew the fight, the consul gave the signal to retreat. A few days passed, both sides resting as if by a tacit truce. During this time, a vast number of people from all the Volscian and Equian states arrived at the camp, certain that the Romans would depart during the night if they sensed their presence. Accordingly, around the third watch, they launched an attack on the Roman camp. Quintius, calming the sudden panic, ordered the soldiers to remain quiet in their tents. He led out a cohort of Hernicians as an advance guard, mounted trumpeters and hornblowers on horseback, and commanded them to sound their instruments before the rampart to keep the enemy in suspense until daylight. Throughout the rest of the night, the camp remained so quiet that the Romans even enjoyed sleep. The sight of armed infantry, whom the enemy believed to be more numerous and Roman, along with the commotion and restless neighing of horses, frightened both by their strange riders and the trumpet blasts, kept the Volscians intently awaiting a Roman attack. When day dawned, the Romans, invigorated by sleep, marched out to battle. In the first onset, they overwhelmed the Volscians, who were exhausted from standing guard and lack of rest. The enemy, however, retreated rather than fled in disarray, as safe hills lay behind them, allowing their ranks to remain unbroken. The consul halted his army when they reached the uneven terrain. The soldiers, eager to pursue the now disheartened enemy, were restrained with difficulty. The cavalry, crowding around the general, pressed more violently, demanding to advance beyond the front line. While the consul hesitated, trusting his men's valor but wary of the ground, everyone shouted their readiness to proceed. Their shouts were immediately followed by action. Fixing their spears in the ground to lighten their ascent, they charged uphill. The Volscians, having exhausted their javelins in the initial engagement, hurled stones at the ascending Romans, disorienting them with incessant blows and driving them back from the higher ground. The Roman left wing was nearly overrun until the consul, shaming their retreat while also chiding their rashness and cowardice, dispelled their fear. First, the Romans held their ground with grim determination. Then, their strength carrying them against those holding the higher position, they ventured forward. Renewing their shout, they encouraged the entire army to advance. With a renewed effort, they forced their way up, overcoming the disadvantage of the terrain. They were on the verge of reaching the summit when the enemy turned their backs. Pursuers and pursuers alike rushed headlong into the Volscian camp, almost as one body. In this confusion, the camp was taken. Those Volscians who could escape fled towards Antium. The Roman army then marched to Antium. After a few days of siege, the city surrendered without any further assault from the besiegers. Their spirits had been broken by the unsuccessful battle and the loss of their camp.